Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's workshop focused on the draft extended day-ahead market tariff revisions. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by John Anders, our legal lead here at the ISO for this initiative, and then a few other members from our ISO legal staff who will be presenting today as well. Before we get started, just a couple reminders. The materials, all the draft tariff language for the extended day-ahead market tariff is available out on the EDAM webpage, and you can get to that page by going to kaiso.com. Then you'll want to click on the Stay Informed tab. Underneath that Stay Informed tab, you'll see policy initiatives. That'll take you out to our main initiative landing page where you can find the EDAM page linked on that main page. And then all the tariff will be posted there on that page. The call today is being recorded, so any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And if you need technical assistance during the meeting at any point, you can send a chat to the event producer. Our event producer today is Michelle. And then instructions for raising your hand to ask a question. We will be stopping for questions along the way today. So if you connected to audio through the WebEx, using that call me option, you can raise your hand using the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you connected to the conference outside of WebEx and just dialed in, you'll need to press #2 to raise your hand. So we'll be keeping an eye out for those throughout the call today. And then please remember to state your name and affiliation before asking your question or making your comment, just so we know who is speaking and which organization you represent. And then you can also send your question or comment in the chat to Isabella Nicosia. Again, that's me. You can send it to me directly, or you can send it to all panelists, and we'll keep an eye out for those too and read it out. So the agenda for today, in just a moment, I'm going to hand it over to John after we get through one more slide here. And then really the bulk of today will be going through those draft tariff revisions for Section 33. And we'll have an hour built in for lunch at noon, and then wrapping up around 3 p.m. today. So we'll leave some time at the end for next steps and closing remarks. So this slide here just gives an overview of where we're at in the initiative stakeholder process. So we did receive joint approval on February 1st of this year. We are targeting Q2 2023 for our tariff filing. And then over on the right-hand side under implementation, you'll see that we're planning for system development to be completed in fall 2024, and then go live and onboarding in spring 2025. So with that, I will hand it over to John, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks a lot, Isabella, and everyone on the call, and particularly those who submitted comments and edits to the draft tariff materials. We really appreciate the constructive input and feedback. It does reflect engagement, collaboration, and we really know it was not a small ask. It's voluminous material, complex. We tried to afford enough time, and we can see that people did take time to provide some meaningful input. So we did receive considerable input, and we've done our best in the couple of weeks since the comments came in to be responsive and reflect your feedback in the materials we'll be reviewing today. We've done that through sort of incremental edits to the draft tariff materials, and also some comments to help guide the discussions. And please, understand that we may not have been able to fully address your comment. It may have been for a lack of understanding of what it was you were trying to communicate. But we really encourage you to take the time with us in these workshops to really, ensure a common understanding, and we'll be working to incorporate these additional discussions into the next iteration of the tariff. Unfortunately, we're just not in a position really at this time to post the materials that we're going to be working from today, but all it is an incremental red line, truly a working copy of the draft tariff materials that were published, on which you've commented and reviewed. So, we're essentially engaging with you in the effort to develop an updated, improved second draft of the tariff. And it's possible in some circumstances that we may not be able to address your concerns, but we do want everyone to make sure that they've been heard and understood. And our ultimate goal out of these workshops is to reflect everyone's input in a complete second draft of the tariff. So we'll be taking all the input we've received so far and the additional input we're going to receive in these workshops. And that ultimate version, we think will be much closer to complete than the initial draft, but we will seek your input again before filing. And at this time, we don't have a specific timeline because we're sort of in the midst of these workshops and digesting and receiving comment. We expect additional comment. So we're targeting the week of June 5th at this point for publication of a second draft of the tariff. And so that's where we're headed. And then today, like Isabella said, we're going to start with Section 33, which is the main section of the EDAM tariff materials, and we'll work our way through that. I'll be passing the baton along at different points, but please, really don't let a section go by. If you had a comment or concern or question, raise your hand and let's get it taken care of. We're going to try to avoid skipping around, although we are going to defer the settlements provisions from Section 3311 and Section 11. And we'll circle back to those after we get through the substance of the Section 33. So that kind of means the general flow is going to be starting out with sort of big picture roles and responsibilities, and then going into the operations, communications, and outages provisions, transmission availability, the transmission revenue recovery, market modeling, bidding and scheduling, then resource sufficiency, IFM, RUC, and finally GHG. So we'll see where we get to on all of that, but from where we are, if we need to pick up again Friday on Section 33, we'll do that, but from there we'll probably move to Section 29, Appendix A, and all of that. But we'll see where we are and then how we're doing after today. We expect many, sort of bigger picture issues structurally and definitionally sort of come up naturally along the way as we discuss. And as those come up, please do share your perspective on these subjects, because they may not fit neatly into a particular tariff section and the like, but we've done our best to call those out, and many of you did bring those up in your comments, in your more general comments. So last, before we get going, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm joined by my colleagues who really helped to develop the underlying tariff and responses and, in individual areas of expertise. And like I said, we'll be sort of passing the ball around a bit. And I'd be happy to pass the ball today. That would mean we're making good progress, but I want to thank them all for their support, and we're really looking forward to productive dialogue during the workshops. So I'm going to ask, I guess, at the outset here with that introduction, if anyone has any sort of questions, really before we get started and open up the materials for review. So let's take a moment, a minute or two, see if anyone has any questions with the introduction, because we're really going to get into it here next.
Yeah, it looks like Sarah Thomas from CPUC has a question. So let's go ahead and unmute Sarah.
Wondering if you have a final date in mind for filing of the tariff with the FERC.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we have a target date right now. So we've always said Q2, so that dates back to late last year, and that means June 30th. So that's the best target date we have, and we're in May, so we're working our way here through the tariff workshops, and we'll evaluate along the way, but that's our target date for now. So. Any other questions?
Any questions in queue?
All right, so John, I passed presenting rights to you if you want to share the materials.
Okay. Let's try. Try that. Is that working, Isabella?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, here we go. So we're going to go from the top. So the highest level here, general provisions, section 33.1. And I'm going to say this, we have, in some cases, answered your comments. In other cases, we've reflected some thoughts for further discussion and all of that. But yeah, we want to go through everything, so we're not going to be, no one will feel unheard. And so please be patient and bear with us if it takes a little while to get to the areas of your interest. But in any event, so the first, there was a comment in a couple places. Folks wanted us to refer to section of the CAISO tariff, and just wanted to let you know that, that the tariff does have rules of interpretation, and this is part of the tariff, so we're not going to do that. We're just going to call them sections, and we don't need to say that they're section of the CAISO tariff. So then there was another comment we got here, and we were asked if we needed this additional language applicable by their terms, and we figured we did not need to include that language here, but you will see that there are other sections within section 33 that parallel section 29, and those when they do parallel, we wanted to keep structural consistency, so we're going to retain that phrase in those areas. Then somebody commented that they prefer the term must and not will, and we have accepted that change. And I see somebody raised their hand, so we're going to try to keep up with hand raises so we don't get too far ahead. Bonnie Blair, I think it was you.
Six Cities, can you hear me okay?
I got you, Bonnie, thanks.
Okay, great. So I was at least one of the people who suggested deleting the by their terms language, and I'm certainly happy to wait, to look more closely at subsequent uses of that phrase. I don't know that I agree with the concept that if it's in section 29, then it belongs in section 33 necessarily, because I think it's more important than structural integrity or consistency between sections 29 and 33 is a clear understanding of what tariff provisions apply to EDAM market participants and what do not. And I think that that phrase in general suggests that unless a section mentions application to EDAM market participants, then it doesn't. And I don't think that's a correct. I think that would lead to a misunderstanding of the sections that EDAM participants are subject to. So with that,
Okay.
having said that,
Yeah.
let's look more closely at the subsequent sections, but like I said, just because it's in, I mean, maybe it shouldn't be in section 29 as is currently in place. But I think it's most important to look at, are we unduly narrowing the scope of provisions that are subject to EDEM or that apply to EDEM market participants by inserting that phrase?
All right, Bonnie, that's a helpful description of your concern. And I'll just say, and maybe we don't take up more time in each context, but I did capture your note here. And we're just a little bit, I don't know if the word's sensitive, but mindful of the applies to tests and governance and all that. And I like consistency throughout, so I think we can go one way or the other without changing the meaning. And there are ways that things become applicable through defined terms, such as CAISO market participants and the like, or scheduling coordinator and the like, that are not unique to EDAM participants. So, all right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So moving down the list, we have a comment where someone was concerned about and how this, was used here in terms of the applicability. And this is really, this was discussed at length in the governance discussions, and it really concerns, the exclusions and what's left to the, authority of the Board of Governors and outside joint authority. And so these are not limited in their applicability to the CAISO grid. So this is the same language in section 29 here. I would assert, as opposed to, the discussion we just had with Bonnie, that this should remain the same in both sections to make sure that the scope is the same, and I don't want to entertain any changes to that. Then moving along, there was another comment, and it was asking about this exception, except in their capacity as EIM market participants. And so this is really our order of precedent language, and whether or not, how these different sections interrelate. We've had a challenge of trying to have the energy imbalance market provisions available to EIM participants that are not interested in an extended day-ahead market, and at the same time extending the day-ahead market and realizing that the day-ahead market participants in EDAM are also real-time market participants in the EIM, and this is how we propose to begin that integration. There's other sections that talk about this, but we have not suggested any changes at this time. But we are, we did read the comments and we understood the comments. And we have a little bit more on that here. I guess, I don't know if anybody that had concerns about this wants to bring these up now. I think this would be a good time, to have a sort of this one of those big picture discussions if we need to consider anything outside or beyond some of the specific areas in the tariffs that'll come up later, where we tried to integrate the two, and we've taken some comments in those specific sections to try to clarify the integration of the day-ahead market into the real-time market as the participation of EDAM entities is really both, right? They're both an EDAM entity in the day-ahead and an EIM entity in the real-time. So let's take a pause here and see if we got any questions or comments about that, and then we'll move on. If people want to raise it later again, that's fine, but let's just kind of take a step back and think about this, and while everyone's fresh, we can have this lawyer discussion.
If you have any questions, as a reminder, you can raise your hand by pressing the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of the screen. And if you connected to audio separately, you'll need to press #2.
I do not see any questions on the line.
Okay, well, let's keep going, and we're going to move now. So in this same section 31, there's a very specific provision. It's about suspension of participation. So this is also available in the energy imbalance market. It applies only for the first 60 days of participation. So it really is, something goes horribly wrong immediately after you enter production, where you need to suspend the participation until you can figure out what's going on. So this has never happened. This has never been invoked, but it's a safety valve in case something starts to go wrong, likely in the realm of reliability or significant market type issues. So that's what this is all about. Here we've got some comments, and we've added some clarification around the scope of the application of this. It's within an EDAM BAA, and this also includes the CAISO, in other words, adverse impacts on any portion of the EDAM area. That would include the CAISO BAA. And so the CAISO is not going to suspend operation of the day-ahead market within its balancing authority area, but it could theoretically, separate or suspend participation in other EDAM BAAs. And the reason I say we're unlikely to suspend the day-ahead market in this way in the CAISO BAA is that we rely on the day-ahead market heavily for our operations and the like, and that would be highly disruptive. So now we go into what the actions of the entity are obligated to do. So we tried to make some clarification here. There were comments that if the EDAM entity, was not in the market, what do they do? Or if they're out of the day-ahead market, are they also in the real-time market? How does all of that work together? So we've added some clarifications that you could have a suspension of a day-ahead market. It's unlikely that you're going to continue the operation of the real-time market in that situation, but it's possible. And so we have both the manual operation of its balancing authority area, which would be the suspension, or if it's operationally prudent to utilize or rely on the market to help with or inform operations, they could continue to submit the bids and the forecast information and the associated meter data to help with the operation of their balancing authority area, but the market would be suspended at that point. So we've made that clarification for both the day ahead and the real time markets. Okay, so that takes us through section 33.1. I'm gonna cheer, we've made it through one subsection, and I'll double check for questions at the end of each, and then we'll move on from there.
Have any questions?
currently no questions in queue.
Okay. Here we have an edit. I think we may have gotten a comment, but not called it out, where we're just making a clarification. This is spelled out elsewhere, but somebody wanted to clarify here in the access to EDAM that only EIM entities may be EDAM entities. And so we've done that for purpose of clarity. And just so everyone knows, just that I forgive me for not doing this, orienting folks, this section 33.2 is really about the access to EDAM. So it's the signing of the implementation agreement and all the readiness activities. It's really everything that has to happen up until we enter production on the implementation date of an EDAM entity, very similar to the energy imbalance market, for everyone familiar with that. So then the first thing we're going to have is execution of an implementation agreement and establishment of the fee. And somebody prefers not to use the term wish, and I would agree with that. And then we had a comment, and here we had a comment from Bonneville that they wanted an affirmative obligation on the ISO to post the executed version of these agreements. And so we're going to follow the energy imbalance market practice. So these are will be pro forma agreements, and our normal practice is not to post pro forma agreements because there's quite a volume of those. But for the entity agreements, or sorry, the implementation agreements, we don't expect a considerable volume of those. And so we can post those on the, I don't know how the web pages will work out with the extended day-ahead market, if they'll rebrand the existing WEIM web page and add something on the extended day-ahead market. Whatever ends up happening, we'll post these implementation agreements there and track the progress accordingly, similar to how we've done in the EIM, so that everybody can follow along with the implementation of new or prospective EDAM entities. So then we had a comment here that wanted a little bit less exclusively within the ISO's control, as far as make it a little bit more collaboratively in terms of the implementation date, and we agree with that. And the real bounds are that the implementation date, it's no less than 6 months. In fact, we've really landed on a sweet spot in the range of 18 months as far as an implementation timeline. And that's pretty much what our project teams have all been working on for all these years with the energy imbalance market. There's been one that was a little less. And then, of course, we've had extensions of the dates that took us beyond that, but that was by extension and not by execution. So some clarifying edits, excuse me. Then we're moving on. We have an obligation for market simulations, parallel operations, reporting, implementation activities. And I had a comment just say, we're not going to engage in these things. We're going to complete these things. And so all the different things that we're going to do. So someone had a comment about what's needed to account for what are these necessary agreements in that bag, and the answer is this is really the other agreements that that we require, the addenda and the other participation agreements for the extended day-ahead market, and really, you know, it's not clear to us what other agreements might be appropriate with other parties, but those will all be identified and called out and part of the project plan, and we'll execute to that. We had a comment, I believe someone wanted to clarify, oh, by the way, we have a lot of contractors working with us, and they should be, you know, called out as important for having access to and training and certifications of certificates of access and all of that kind of stuff. All right. So forecasting, the only edit we had really was down here, and someone said it's redundant, and we agreed it's a day-ahead forecast diverse. They're by definition renewable. So I don't know. We've said forecast. It's not a defined term. It didn't seem troubling to us, but these are the identified requirements for the extended day-ahead market. You'll see that they're a little bit more precise than what we had in the energy imbalance market. And we've done that to ensure that through the readiness activities, the forecasting, elements of forecasting are all captured and reflected before, really market sim and certainly parallel operations, let alone production. We're calling that out here and make sure, because forecasting, as we all know, is becoming more and more important, and it's certainly critical in the day ahead as so many things relate back to the forecast. A quick edit to capitalize a defined term, and I'm not going to go into the EDAM DAME relationship yet. We'll get there, I think, down the road when we have some other references, but we'll talk about that. So someone said, why do they have to show their ability to pass the resource efficiency evaluation? And it's really because within market sim and parallel ops, prior to go live, we need to have confidence in the results. And so we have not suggested any changes to that requirement for readiness. And someone then asked for clarification that these are initial registrations, because in the EDAM in particular, the transmission rights are going to basically be an ongoing effort, some sort of hopefully semi-automated process whereby changes in transmission service are updated and eligible for treatment, scheduling, availability, and all that in EDAM. All right. Another comment. We did. Somebody said may be scheduled in the day-ahead market, because the customer doesn't always have to schedule their rights. They may just, not use them, but this doesn't change their rights and the way that they would implement them under section 33.18, which we'll get to in a little while. I saw a question pop up whether we were going to post this material, and I think it was Chris Devon, and the answer is we will post this material after the workshops as a second draft. We're just not in a position right now. This is really a working document. We're trying to seek your feedback and comments, and we will clean things up and republish as a second draft. But I hope that answers your question, Chris. All right, the transmission revenue recovery. I think there was a comment about what they would provide, and they're going to provide information and documentation to account for their revenue and a cross-reference so nobody gets confused as to where that reference points. Down here, again, contractors and vendors for certificate access, market simulation and settlements, parallel ops, now readiness. So there were some folks having questions. Why is it 10 days and not 30 days? I just saw another comment pop up. Do we know the timing of when we're going to publish the revised draft? and our target is the week of June 5th. So we're going to take the feedback we received today and make adjustments, further adjustments in the draft tariff language, and post a revised draft. And the reason for the timing like this, we want your input, we want your feedback. We certainly received a considerable amount, and it's reflective here, but we need a little bit more time to present back to you all a complete red line draft, and we don't want too many versions out there bouncing back and around and confusing folks. So this is our plan. We can have another next steps discussion around that, but that's our plan for now. All right, getting back into the readiness. So with the 10-day rather than the 30-day, like for the EIM, you'll recall that for in the WEIM, there's a 30-day and a FERC filing and all kinds of things. This gives us a little bit more room to work things through in parallel operations, and a little bit more flexibility if we want to compress the timelines and not have a full 30 days of parallel operations after we've already done at least 30 days of parallel operations. Here, someone had a comment about whether is it just the systems and processes, or are you guys ready? And so we just figured, you know, it's an unnecessary, yeah, the systems and processes might not be ready, but maybe the people aren't ready. So we're just going to say, yeah, say they're all ready. And I can't recall here, but I'm pretty sure someone had a comment about additional clarity. That when is the readiness? It's on the implementation date as contemplated the activities above. And then the last provision in this section, we can adjust things if we need to, and we just all we have to do is amend the EDAM entity agreement according to its terms, or the implementation agreement, excuse me. And that's what we've done in the past. We just adjusted the milestone schedule and posted that on our webpage so that people were informed of the change in the implementation date. Okay, so that's all about access to EDAM and the various implementation activities. And I'm going to open it up for questions, and then we're going to get into a more probably substantive section, 33.4. And it's the roles and responsibilities. And here we have quite a bit more to talk about.
There are currently no questions in queue.
Okay, all right. So, well, 33.3, that's not used. So just so folks know, in the ultimate version of the tariff, this will probably not appear. It would just be not used, so it'd just be a blank. No purpose in that kind of language. But we've left it in here for everybody's reference, so everybody understands why it's not being used. Okay, so 33.4 roles and responsibilities. Okay, lot going on in this section overall, and this is at a high level describes the various roles and responsibilities. And I'd have to say probably the more important of the two at this point are the roles, because in fact the responsibilities as they're laid out here are of course important, but once you sign the agreement, there are other responsibilities under the agreement under Section 33 in the ISO tariff. So this is really responsibilities at a high level, but it is the roles. And we received a lot of comments in this section about the roles and the relationship between the roles, and like functional responsibilities and how that relates to the roles. So we've added we added a transmission service provider role as a new role and contractual relationship between the ISO and an EDAM transmission service provider, in addition to the EDAM entity. So that's a new role. And also in response to comments, we've clarified that the load serving entity role is separate from the EDAM entity role. So this will, sort of help facilitate the separation of function within a vertically integrated utility and that sort of a thing without really doing any harm. It just means that the entity would also have a load serving entity agreement with the ISO in addition to the entity arrangement. So, all right, I think the best way to cover all this is just to go through, and we'll review those rules when we get to them individually. So, all right. Here was one of the structural type of comments where there was some concern that the incorporation of Section 4 was over-inclusive, but we need to remember that as a participant in the extended day-ahead market, EDAM market participant, a CAISO market participant, and there will be other roles that aren't specifically called out here that'll come into focus as that participation. And off the top of my head is, well, obviously the sketching coordinator registration and responsibilities in that process applies, but I'd say that like convergent bidding entities, because of the convergent bidding, requirements in the extended day-ahead market, there will be convergent bidding entities within the extended day-ahead market, and those entities are responsible for entering into those other agreements and meeting those other requirements that are not reflected here in Section 33.4. So that's the reference back to Section 4, and the reason it's the same and the same here as it is in Section 29. I suppose if we ever had congestion revenue rights, then you could have CRR entities, but we don't have that yet. So convergent bidding is the one that comes to mind. Somebody preferred to say this, Section 33, and never crystal clear to me, but we're okay with that here. We had another comment about interruption of the normal operation of the day-ahead market, and how does that work? And all we're saying here is, if anything happens where the market's interrupted, that we're individually responsible for managing our operations within our balancing authority, with or without the results that might be available from the market. And this is a parallel with the EIM in terms of the entity's roles and responsibilities, and the CAISO relative to those roles and responsibilities. So this is the highest level for the ISO, and then the EDAM entities' responsibilities. And we did do one thing, which was to break out from the entity, the transmission service provider, roles and responsibilities, and to say that the EDAM entity transmission service provider would remain the transmission service provider within that balancing area, And then the CAISO will remain the transmission service provider for capacity on the ISO grid. And these provisions were previously reflected in section 33.18 in the introductory language there, but we've moved it back to here. It seems to follow from these other sections, and it ties in neatly with this comment and question about what this means in the context of the EDAM. And so since we got a new role, it makes it clear, and so it's here and not there. Okay, so the first role function we have is the entity function, and so we had a question from the San Diego Gas and Electric, and so don't feel like we're picking on San Diego. It just sometimes we call entities out or parties out or commenters out, and sometimes we didn't, and it wasn't it was more of a matter of individual authorship and evolving thinking as we worked on these documents over the last couple of weeks. So please don't take any offense. I think I saw somebody raise a hand. I want to try to catch these as quickly as I can. It looks like VJ may have a raised hand. Can we take that comment?
WRA, thank you, John. If we go, I think mine is a very trivial question. If we go up to the earlier page, keep going right here. Yep, right there under the line called during any interruption of the normal operation. Maybe I'm being a little naive here, but are you implying the regular existing day-ahead market, correct? Or what will be the newer day-ahead market with EDAM entities joining in? I'm just trying to clarify what is meant here, because I understand the exemption in the governance structure that allows for if any operational issues or reliability issues impact the CAISO control grid, the CAISO manages that. So I'm just trying to understand
Right.
This day-ahead market reference is to what? Thank you.
No, appreciate that, VJ. And it's here, and it also, that was basically San Diego's comment that I was just about to get to.
Yeah, I figured.
And so, yeah, so, and this occurs in lots of different places. So this is sort of one of those definitional structural things. But conceptually, what's going on and how we view it is that the CAISO is extending the day-ahead market to other balancing authority areas in the West. And, you know, how that happens and all of that is the subject of this section of the tariff. And so, and the agreements and all that. And so it's really in the what's called the EDAM area. What's really operating is the CAISO's day-ahead market. It's not an EDAM or some different market or something, and then it's different in the CAISO. There's different rules for the extension of the market because you have to have transfers
Exactly.
between balancing areas and all of these things. And some of those things include the CAISO balancing area, right? Because transfers is a good example. We're engaged in EIM transfers, and we have rules about how we make our transmission available for those transfers and all of that. And the same thing's happening here. And then definitionally or with terminology, the way we've done it, and there could have been different ways, and I think it was 6 cities suggested specific definitions for different balancing areas and the like, was we've decided to say it's a EDAM entity balancing authority area if it's unique to something happening within a balancing area other than the CAISO, or if it's unique to the CAISO, we say, as we have here, the CAISO balancing area. And then if it's everybody, it's then it's a balancing authority area in the EDAM area. So that includes all the balancing areas in the EDAM. So that's how we chose to do it for the EIM, right or wrong. You could have had defined terms and done it that way, or this or that. And so that we've used the same structure or definitional approach here.
Thank you. I'm not the writing expert here on tariffs, but I will just give my one comment but thank you for answering. Is that I think it would have been nice or helpful to appreciate this document with some form of defined terms that classifies these three different situations we have. We have the day-ahead market and the participants in that. We have the EDAM external entities participating in the EDAM. You have third-party participants, and then you have the ISO control grid with ISO being the BA as well. So I had to keep up a lot here, but just a feedback. I'm not criticizing, but thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Vijay. I mean, if you try to diagram this in like Venn diagrams or something, I mean, there's a lot of different things happening. I mean, you know, some of these entities are participating in our day-ahead market, but they're also EIM entities. And then, you know, so yeah, there's a lot of different layers. And so we think it all works. It's held together well so far. So thank you. All right, so that I think answers San Diego's question as well. And, you know, in other words, fundamentally underlying all of this, it's the same market, it's the day ahead market. And that's why we refer to the day ahead market and in terms of operations and throughout, rather than the extended day ahead market, because really underlying all of this is the day ahead market. We're in the same market as the EDAM entities will be. Okay. Back to where I was. So some shifts, I'll call them shifts, around these roles and responsibilities. And these you're going to see here are primarily due to what I talked about before, which was the addition of the transmission service provider role and the clarification of the load serving entity role as it relates to the EDAM entity. And so here there were a lot of places in the tariff where we had previously said the EDAM entity will ensure that each EDAM transmission service provider in its balancing area does blank, and here it's provisions and its fact. And so we got a lot of comments, well, hey, you know, we can't be responsible to ensure that these entities have done this or that or the other thing, because they may not be the same entity, like vertically integrated in that sense. So we thought there's enough going on here in terms of transmission service that this warrants a separate relationship. So we've created a new agreement, the EDAM Transmission Service Provider Agreement. We'll get to that eventually. And it's very pro forma, and no surprises there. It refers back to the tariff, and we'll go over the roles and responsibilities here. But that's essentially what we're saying. And you'll see these kinds of changes to eliminate this insurer obligation throughout the draft tariff. And we won't go over it each time, but that's the background and purpose. I think, in other words, that's important. Moving back a little bit to the load serving entity obligation, it is a responsibility. We're saying identify. So in other words, a load serving entity needs to determine who's the load serving entities within the BA and inform the CAISO which of them are necessary to enable operation of the market in their BAA. And we'll get to the different load serving entity responsibilities down below. here, we've removed this, as that's now an obligation of the EDAM transmission service provider and not the EDAM entity. And same here, with information and transmission capacity available in the day-ahead market. Now, all right, I see Todd's got a question, and I'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to make one point here. We still have an important requirement, and that is the EDAM entity scheduling coordinator is going to be the entity that represents the transmission service providers within its balancing area. So the ISO, it's really important that in terms of what transmission capacity is available, has a single point of contact. And the single point of contact is the same for the real-time and day-ahead market. And in that instance, it is the EDAM entity scheduling coordinator for both, you know, in the real-time EIM entity and in the day-ahead EDAM entity scheduling coordinators. So, okay, so there's a lot going on here. I'll go ahead and take Todd's question, and then we'll go from there.
Hey, John, it's good to see you. Just to clarify and make sure I'm understanding where it was going, because we had a question overall on it. So if there's load serving entities within the BA that is the EDAM entity that have not joined, they're not affiliated with the EDAM entity, does it, the way this is written, mean that they can decide not to participate in the EDAM market?
No. The way it would work would be all the load within the BAA, and particularly served by the transmission, you know, system within the BAA, would be a load serving entity within that BAA. We just don't know who all they are. So unless they're a separate BAA, that load is in the EDAM, and that load needs to be represented by an EDAM load serving entity. And so if it's not the you know, not rolled up under the EDAM entity like in the EIM and separately represented, that's okay, but they need to sign an agreement, and then they need to either, you know, self-schedule the load or bid in the load in a day ahead, and there'd be all the convergence bidding rules would apply to them as well within the BAA as that operation went into effect. Does that help, Todd?
It helps. It's good clarification. It doesn't. Well, I think we'll be looping back with you, but I just wanted to clarify what was intended or not, because when you started breaking it out by load serving entities, that kind of I was just wondering whether that suggested that they could potentially be out of the market. But thank you for clarifying. The intent is that they're in the market.
That is the intent. Yeah, we need all the load in the BAA within the forecast or whatever, and all that to be in there. You know, there's been I think I saw another hand go up. So we'll take that if there is, and there will be more on the load serving entities.
Hear me?
And in a minute. Yeah, I got you.
Great. This is Elvis Svoboda from PG&E. I was just more of a curiosity. So you described the EDAM entity being the transmission service provider being represented via a scheduling coordinator. One, is that a new type of an arrangement? Because typically, being on the generation side, I think of a scheduling coordinator being someone who bids, who represents generation and load into the market and not transmission. And also, is it possible then that CAISO could have its own scheduling coordinator as a consequence of this interpretation here in the tariff?
Okay, yeah. Take the second one first. That the answer to that is no, that we're not contemplating that the ISO would be a EDAM transmission service provider and schedule its, available capacity into the market and all of that stuff.
Is that a statement of intention or definition there, though? Is that, I mean,
It should be by definition that
Okay.
I don't think we fall in the definition of EDAM transmission service provider.
okay, thank you. And on the other,
And then the other question, it's let me get my head catching back up to the first question.
it was just,
Remind me the first question.
well, it was just that I'm not familiar with the scheduling coordinator acting as a representative of
Oh, yeah.
transmission service providers.
Fair enough. So the way it's going to work is for the EDAM entity would be the transmission service provider scheduling coordinator with the ISO, the EDAM entity scheduling coordinator. So things like limits and all of the things that it would have is, say, the TOP and all of that stuff, and all of that stuff would come from the EDAM entity scheduling coordinator. And then we're going to have also things happening in the market. So depending on how much transmission is available from the service provider and all of those kinds of limits, those would be submitted by the entity scheduling coordinator. However, the service provider has customers, and so those individual transmission service provider customers, they will have a scheduling coordinator with the ISO to schedule their transmission, their use of the transmission system. And then the ISO will, of course, be calculating all of the different transfer limits and everything else. And we'll get to that in section 33.18.
Okay, but basically this function is there's certain types of data that would be provided by the EDAM entity transmission service provider scheduling coordinator related to transmission limits. Is there any requirement that that function be separate from the more typical scheduling coordinator functions, or is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the way we have it is that in this same section here, down below, if I can find it. It's in the EDAM scheduling coordinator. Well, I won't
get to it.
I won't go there. But basically what it says is, it says that a EDAM entity scheduling coordinator may not also be a participating resource or I guess supposed transmission service provider unless it's functionally separate from, the merchant. So you have a vertically integrated utility, they have a merchant function, transmission function. They can both participate in the EIM and be the same corporate parent, but they're functionally separate. And then they have all the certificates of access to ensure that separation. Similar
Maybe two separate scheduling coordinators.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Exactly
Thank you.
right.
Thank you very much.
That's why you have separate agreements for all of that stuff. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions while we're here?
No other questions in queue.
Okay. All right. So we're still on the entity, and we had some stakeholders seeking additional clarification, which resources are available, and they were concerned that this term "eligible to participate" was somehow provided them veto authority over which resources could participate. So we don't have this, we don't share that concern. Essentially, that the idea here is that any resource that's eligible, any resource type, I should say, eligible for participation in the CAISO markets. So this has evolved over time, with demand response type resources, storage type resources, and those kinds of things. As those continue to evolve, this would continue to evolve. But then we're not responsible for determining which resources are eligible within the BAA. So not all of these resources may or may not be eligible for transmission service or whatever. So they basically need to, take transmission service from the EDAM transmission service provider under a tariff of some kind. And then once they're enabled in that manner, then they would be eligible to participate. And the transmission service provider tariff will describe which resources are, pseudotide resources, obviously generation and the like and all of that. So that's what these edits are all about. A little bit of clarity, but not making a fundamental change. Okay. Well, we're going slow, so I might as well highlight this one here. That way we won't have to get to it later and slow us down at a different point in time. So, I guess definitionally, we had made some proposed definitions and then some proposed edits to existing definitions. And so in the CAISO markets today, there's two concepts. One is the facility, the sort of physical facility, and the other is the owner and operator of the facility. And so we have defined terms for each and different references to each. I wasn't around when this was created, but that's the way it works. And so that's what we've done here. So the EDAM resource facility is the physical facility, and the EDAM resource is the owner or operator. And they may or may not be the same person. They might be shares of different resources and all of these different things that could happen. But we've tried to clarify everything, and we've proposed to use these terms throughout, and this resulted in some changes. And when we get to section 29, I'd be happy to talk about it there, because we did have some changes to the specific references to participating resource versus non-participating resource in section 29. I think I'd like to hold those kind of comments until we get there, but I just thought I'd raise that here. And I did see Todd's hand go up, so let's go ahead and take a comment here. Did I misinterpret that? I'll keep going until someone interrupts me. Okay, here's another place where we've transitioned the responsibilities to the transmission service provider. And then one last change. Okay, so now, and I'm not going to go into all of these different provisions essentially, but what we've done is we've created a new function or role, and we've defined what that is and what the transmission service provider must do. And so we've listed them out, and they are largely what was previously captured by the insure references that were appearing throughout the agreement, or sorry, the tariff. And so we've reflected those here, basically have provisions affecting its tariff to enable operation of the market, and use the entity as the scheduling coordinator, provide information about transmission available in the market, ensure customers submit the schedules in the day-ahead market, and secure representation by a scheduling coordinator. So that's the big new role. I think we talked enough about that. People can follow up. But then the entity scheduling coordinator role, this is the companion. Not a lot of changes there. It's relatively clear. So here we're shifting away from the entity and the service provider to the resource. And so let me see what kind of questions we had here. Okay, this is the same question, whether we need to define them separately from the owner or operator. I think I already went through all of this in terms of what the ISO does, and whether we want to whether we want to change our approach or practice. And I think we're going to stick with this approach. So first thing they have to do is sign the addendum. And we had a comment here that this was a correct comment. PacifiCorp wanted to clarify that it was at the resource facility and not just the resource, and the answer is yes. Here we've moved some language to the start of section 34, 33.4.1. Up here, that's right here. And then PacifiCorp had a question whether it was necessary, given the way that these obligations are worded and the breadth of the obligations. And we agreed that this could be removed, so it becomes a very simple provision. So here's the debate about participating resource or non-participating resource, or resource versus participating resource. And we've attempted to address these. I don't think it's worth our time, collectively, to go through every one of these references. I think what we'll do is explain it here as we've done, and we'll make our edits according to what we think is the right approach. And if folks are still having concerns on round two, we'll go through that again. But I think we'll just keep moving along. So then you have the companion resource scheduling coordinator. Not many changes here. So then you have the load serving entity, and up above we talked about the EDAM, and here's the load serving the entity. Sorry, and here's the load serving entity and their representation of the load. Comment whether they would have access to non-public, should they be able to submit bids on behalf of EDAM LSEs. This is part of the reason why we've made it clear that EDAM entity will need to execute its own load serving entity, so that there's no functional issues created by the entity. They shouldn't have an issue. We do make information available to the entity without price information, but this will help clarify the roles and responsibilities. And we have the load serving entity scheduling coordinator. And another comment from PacifiCorp. So we've clarified that the load represents, it doesn't need authorization from the entity. It's just been identified, and once been identified by the entity, then they're required to sign an agreement with the ISO and represent that load and secure the necessary transmission service under the transmission service provider tariff, and then register with the ISO. Okay. All right. Last, and then we're going to wrap up this section anyway. We wanted to, so this was our initial attempt, and we appreciate the feedback. It's helpful to make sure that there was, we called it one-to-one relationship. It's basically that the participants in the day-ahead market are aligned with the participation in the real-time market, whether it's the BA or the load serving entity or the resources, that the scheduling coordinator IDs associated with a portfolio of resources or load or whatever it is the same portfolio and the same scope of responsibilities under that ID in this day in the real-time market. And so we've added some clarifying language to make that more clear. We agree with stakeholders, and so we've said that it's necessary that the scope of extended participation is aligned with the same scope of representation in the energy imbalance market or any scheduling coordinator participation in the real-time market. So that's it for the roles and responsibilities. I'll pause for a moment here, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. I think Bill Weaver is on communications, and so I can get a drink of water, something like that. And do we have any other questions, roles and responsibilities?
Todd, did you have a question? We saw your hand from earlier, so if you want to re-enter the queue, go ahead. All right, I'm not seeing any questions at this point.
I'm going to stop sharing then. Let me hit save. So.
And then Michelle, can we pass presenting rights over to Bill Weaver? Okay, go ahead, Bill.
Yep, moving on to section 6. I'll go ahead and just share mine, and just so John can take a break here. Okay, can you guys see that? Okay, is that zoomed in sufficiently? A little more, I guess. Yeah, Isabella, Michelle, good?
Yes, we can see it. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, well, section 33.6, I don't think we received significant amount of comments here or much controversy, and I think we only have a few small edits, but these mostly mirror, the existing technical requirements for the CAISO and for the EAM, so shouldn't have been too many surprises here. We received one question on the CCP definition, not being in Appendix A. Likely we should also put it in Appendix A, but it really does refer to the industry standard term for intercontrol center communication protocol. That's definitely something, an engineer came up with, right? Moving on, we had one question here from Pattern Energy on the variable energy resource forecast communications, asking how these requirements. So here again, this is a VER that's using an independent forecasting service and providing it to the CAISO. Pattern's asking how that would apply to a VER dynamically scaling to EDM external interties, and like for other VERs in the CAISO EDM, we don't have a specific carve out for this requirement. But if I think a Pattern or others have anything specific on this issue, they want. This sounds like someone's thinking about a specific resource with specific technical challenges. We're happy, you can reach out to me or to Milos, and we can put you in contact with our forecasting team to discuss any special requirements or how these can work with such a resource. But other than that, that was pretty much it for the communications section. Hope I've gone sufficiently slowly to give John a break, but does anyone have any questions here? We'll get more into some of these when we get down to, I think, 3310 on telemetry and metering, which are kind of more detailed requirements, and also on the specific VER and forecasting requirements themselves. But these are sort of fundamental basic communication sections. Okay, well, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, I will pass it back until later. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.
All right, Michelle, can we pass it back over to John?
I'm sorry, which John? John
John
Anders, right?
Anders.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay. All right, John, you're all set.
Okay. Do that next time. All right. All right, maybe over lunch break, Isabel will teach me how to just share the application so I don't share my screen and notifications pop up and all that. But anyway, moving on. Section 33.7. So this is sort of the operation provision of the EDAM, and it does get into one section in particular of interest, and that's sort of the relative priorities of EDAM transfers to demand in really the most likely the real-time type corner case, situation. But we'll cover that here. But we're just moving along, and under normal operations, I think we had a comment around which timeframes we're in, and the ISO doesn't issue dispatch instructions in that time frame. And so, yes, that is correct. The day ahead produces schedules and not dispatch instructions. But, in other words, we're not going to exceptionally dispatch, resources in EDAM. It's just self schedules and bids and all the rest of it that come in to the market. And I think that should clarify that. And then we've added the exceptional dispatch language here. We don't have authority to do that, so I don't know why we would try to do that, but nonetheless, if it helps. Okay, so then we have essentially the modeling of transfers, and this is very high level, but it's that we model and manage the transfers as at the internal interties. And we did get a comment from BAMX and whether we actually sort of like do this dynamically as we do in the real time. And what we've done to address that is to remove this language so that we're just basically calculating the net scheduled transfers from the BAAs and driving the net scheduled transfers and schedules on the interties. So I think that's it for modeling, and I'll go to, I think, was it Silva? I saw a hand go up. PG&E.
Yes, just to check that our ancillary services included in transfers, they're not listed there.
I'm gonna call on a friend here in the online, maybe one of the subject matter experts could help me out.
John, this is James Lynn. They are not included because we're not optimizing ancillary services in the EDAM area at this time. If we do get to the point where we are optimizing ancillary services and going across the EDAM footprint, then we will consider ancillary service transfers.
So in the initial
addition, John,
there will be no
that.
sharing of ancillary services between EDAM entities.
Go ahead, George. And
yeah, thank you. This is George Angelevis with you. So just a clarification. So we're not going to have support for optimized ancillary services transfers for the reasons that James Lynn articulated, but we will support bucket one, non-optimized ancillary services transfers for the BAs that they want to exercise those to, to support reserve groups. So if there are contractual agreements between BAAs for the provision of an ancillary service from one BA to the other, and we want to represent that and count that in the RSC, then these BAAs could declare bucket one ancillary services transfers to the ISO so that we can take them into consideration in the RSC. But they're not going to be optimized, they're going to be fixed. Thank you.
Right, but that was exactly my question. They would still be sort of accounted for in the total transfer, though, wouldn't they? Because they limit residual transfer.
Yes, our assumption is that the BAAs will have to designate transmission rights specific to those ancillary services transfers and have them carved out from whatever rights are released for optimization in EDAM or in other transfers. Yes.
So at least in concept, they're under that included rubric. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Alva. That was helpful clarification. And these other products do include capacity, but you're right on that AS. So we'll clarify that. Thank you. Okay. So the concept of manual dispatch exists. We don't really, it's not the same necessarily as in the EIM. In other words, in the day-ahead market, there's really no such thing in the day-ahead market context. But in the time frames between the day-ahead market and the real-time market, there is a concept that this could happen. And so if that does happen, then they submit the self-schedule for that manual dispatch. All right. Disruption, EDAM disruption. So this is, we got several comments on this seeking some clarification. The basic premise of this whole section is to incorporate the market disruption authority as the market operator in situations where the day-ahead market, fails to produce expected results. And this authority includes the enumerated actions below. And a lot of the clarification was whether or not this would also be triggered, could be triggered if it was the ISO participation in the EDAM area. And I think the biggest provision in this context would be the separation concept. In other words, can we, the CAISO balancing area, separate from the EDAM area, the rest of the EDAM area, if necessary to maintain the day-ahead market, integrity or its operations or whatever. And so that's this clarification that we've entered here. All right, I'm going to take Alva's comment. We'll go to the raised hand for Alva. Are you off of mute yet, Alva?
There I am. Just curious on this. When there's a potential market failure in the CAISO market, day-ahead market today, CAISO has, as a market operator, has the discretion to pull bids. Is that covered under this? Because it seems like it's basically throwing it over to the other EDAM entities rather than expressing the ability of the market operator to take steps that might allow a feasible solution to exist.
I'm going to ask for help. I don't think we do. I'm going to go back up above to where we incorporate it. So this is the reason is, so in the CAISO BA and the CAISO today, the day ahead market today, all of our market disruption authority is in section 7. And so then here for EDAM, we've extended these additional provisions for market participants. And I do not believe that that bid insertion or bid removal has been included in either the energy imbalance market or the day ahead market. But
Okay.
I'll ask for others, perspective on that if that's not right or if we don't think that's right. But yeah, I think the big one, like I said, for the CAISO was that we could separate from the EDAM area if somehow there was a disruption that required us to interrupt our participation with, separate from the other BAAs. Does that help, Alva?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think you should consider figuring out how to have that authority because it's generally the quickest way to achieve a solution to the market. And if you're continually having to separate simply due to, I mean, these can essentially be cyber errors that aren't caught by cyber sometimes. And so you could find yourself having to separate a lot more frequently than you think if you don't have that kind of authority. That's just my opinion, though. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alva. And I did see a hand, I think it was CPSC. Sarah.
Yeah, can we unmute Sarah Thomas, please?
Would you scroll back up to the section you were just showing? I
Sure.
just
That
caught
introductory
something.
language,
Uh,
introductory,
where-
was it this one here?
I apologize.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, so it says under 33.7, EDAM operations under normal and emergency conditions,
Mm-hmm.
and then jumps immediately into section 7 of the CAISO tariff will not apply. I just think that's a little bit confusing because it assumes that you've read the heading in order to understand the body of the tariff.
Okay.
So you might want
So-
to introduce, before you say section 7 will not apply, you may want to say when section 7 will not apply.
Yeah, understood. Basically clarify that section 7 continues to apply in the CAISO BAA for CAISO market operations within. Is that what you're thinking as well?
Well, I mean, I apologize if I'm just hanging us
No,
up.
no,
It just says EDAM, the title is EDAM operations under normal and emergency conditions. And then it just says section 7 will not apply. So I guess I would want to be clear about when it is that section 7 doesn't apply.
Hey, John, this is Heather. I think what Sarah may be raising is just kind of the way we're using the headings almost as a sentence in and of themselves. And we do this in a few places, Sarah. And so I think we can just think about how to kind of better incorporate the title of our section with the text that comes next. And so that's probably a broader comment.
Exactly.
But I think well taken. And I think we can incorporate some of that in that sentence.
Thanks, Heather.
Okay, thank you. All right, so back down below. Okay, so now we have some lingering comments, and I will go into these with some help from my colleagues, in particular. So in the response to a CAISO, response to an EIM disruption, now that we've added the CAISO BAA, we went over all that. but basically we enforce a net transfer constraint for the affected BAA to separate it from the remainder of the EDAM area. And the question we got was whether this is the same in the EIM as in the EDAM, or if it needs to be more specifically described. We won't go into the specific description, but if someone can confirm that the enforcement of the net transfer constraint is the mechanism by which we would separate the affected EDAM entity BAA from another, that would be helpful.
Hi, it's Sarah
And if
Thomas
not,
again.
Okay.
There was an article in today's Cal Energy Markets, or maybe it was Friday's, that talked about changes that were made to the transfer authority.
Oh, the EDAM transfers.
Times of grid stress within California. And I just was wondering, is this the change that article refers to, if you know?
So my suspicion is no. I think we're going to get to that in the next section, 33.7.5, where we talk about operations in like these corner case scenarios and stuff that everyone's talked about. This is just simply saying if there's a market disruption and we need to separate the balancing areas from each other and operate the market within the balancing area without transferring for a market related issue, not an operational issue, but like a grid operation issue, but like a market disruption. Then this is how we do that. So I'll take this back. So then we're moving along, reduce or suspend the transfers, including the CAISO in accordance with, and this was your comment. So that's how we suspend transfers between BAAs. And I'll get to section 33.7.5 below. And then we've added or take other similar actions within the CAISO BAA. I'm getting something in our chat. Looks like we're gonna lock the transfers. So I think this is correct. The net transfer constraint locks the transfers. Then we had this is sort of the price in addition of the following use market results. Take any of the actions specified in section 7.6. We had a question about whether or not we consider administrative prices and who establishes the administrative price. If we include an administrative price or enforce an administrative price outside of the ISO's balancing authority area. And I'll apologize, I didn't get to this, so we're going to have to come back to this unless somebody has an answer. Admin prices are all defined, okay. And I understand that we do have the administrative pricing authority. It's just not, it's going to extend into the EDAM, but who would determine the administrative price? And I think that's an EDAM entity OAT transmission service function. So maybe we could talk about that at another time. Okay. All right, Sarah, you got another question?
Apologies. You're mentioning the chat. We participants can't see the chat. So if you're referring to something in chat that you think is that the non-panelists should know, you might want to just say what it is.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, no, all we see here is the chat from the group or whatever, the group chat, and I was referring to a separate note from one of my SMEs. Sorry about that. I got confused. And what they were confirming was that when we lock transfers, that's how we isolate the BAA, and the net enforcing a net transfer constraint is how you lock the transfers. Is the operational terminology for that. So apologies for the confusion. Okay. So next, we had a comment about, we're talking now about the EDAM's responsibility or EDAM entity's responsibility and the EDAM entity's obligation and whether or not they would required to continue to submit all bids in the real-time market, and whether that's the responsibility of the EDAM entity. And, you know, this is really addressed in section 29.7, which all applies to the EDAM entity as a EIM entity. I think we could remove this from here. We'll have the okay. So finally, in this area, we had the communication and the requirement to inform the ISO prior to curtailing EDAM transfers, and which is what we're going to talk about next in this provision here. And the communication is requirement here is as soon as practicable, and to continue and coordinate and communicate with the ISO. But the main provision on coordination and communication when you're dealing with curtailment of transfers, sort of outside of the market in the operational timeframes, this is the provision here, and we did receive several comments on transfer priorities and how to clarify this provision. So I'll go through these below. This is sort of the first section where we get into some of the issues related to transmission availability that have been, you know, were the subject of extensive discussions in the stakeholder process. And also we received a number of comments around this, and the other section is more around the availability of the transmission to the EIM or EDAM, sorry. This is all about the transfer priority relative demand in terms of the operator's discretion, sort of, and like I said, to quote unquote, you know, intervene in the market for whatever reasons, not directly in the market, but curtailing transmission is going to affect the market. And so we wanted to have extra provision around this, and some clarification has been added. Somebody asked, what is an EDAM transfer? And so essentially we've defined it as such, but what we're talking about here is we're not just talking about any actions on a transmission system within a BAA. We're talking about EDAM transfers, which are specific to internal interties between participating BAAs in the EDAM. And these are the transfers that have been established in the market, you know, based on the available transmission and the optimization through that market. And then when we're going along after that, those transfers have been established and the day-ahead schedules have all been issued and all of that, what's the relative priority of those transfers and those schedules in terms of real time and the operation of that BAA. And so in the other section on availability, we talk about the priority of these cleared schedules in the real-time market. So that's all in the market. Here we're talking about sort of aftermarket actions by an EDAM entity or the CAISO to reduce or suspend transfers. So this is likely to be after the market runs, the real-time market, sorry, in this case, and we're now into more of a real-time, and this is those kind of corner case things that we all talked about at length, and the confidence in transfers and all the rest of that. So what we said here, and everyone saw this in the draft, but what we're doing is we're adding some clarification that the curtailment of transmission, so this is the underlying curtailment of the transmission that's providing or supporting the transfer. So that's going to be accomplished in accordance with the transmission service provider tariff or the CAISO tariff. So that's what determines the priority and the relative curtailment, and then it's communicated to impacted BAAs in advance, if practicable, or immediately following the suspension or reduction. We had some comments that there may be operational conditions where advanced communications is simply not practical. So we've added that little breathing room for the operations teams to make these decisions in real time and communicate that back out. And so this communication continues until resolution of the underlying circumstances. And basically, we've cross-referenced a section of the energy imbalance market in terms of how do you know when the underlying reduction or suspension has been resolved, and generally it be reflected in the results where we provide information back to the EIM entity in this case in terms of what transmission constraints have been relaxed in the real-time market. And so this could be part of the information, but if there's other information, we'd be happy to look at that. So again, it's the priorities in the tariff that determine, you know, and they take, they don't, you're only undertaking the reductions or suspensions in a manner that's not unduly discriminatory, taking into account the priorities in the tariff and any actual or potential involuntary curtailment of demand. So that's the sort of crux of this in a nutshell. And I'm just going to highlight this, and I'm going to open this up for any questions. I don't think this goes on for any longer. Yep. Okay. I'm going to ask to see if there's any questions around these changes. So again, this is real-time frame, and it's the reduction or suspension of EDAM transfers by a BAA within the EDAM area, and their obligations to only do so in a manner not unduly discriminatory, taking account the priorities in the tariffs, and also factoring in any potential involuntary curtailment of demand. So I'd like to open that up. Do we have any questions, comments?
As a reminder
I
to raise,
do not see any questions.
yeah, and as a reminder to raise your hand, you can press the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen, or you can press #2, and that will raise your hand as well.
Okay. So again, we have a not used section, and then get to hand things off, and maybe if we can get through the next two sections, so that'd be outages and contingencies, 33.9, and then I think it's metering and telemetry in 33.10. That would be skipping over 33.11, and that'll bring us to the transmission availability discussion just after lunch. So that should probably work well. I think that's an important topic, and it'll take us a little bit of time to get through that. So I'm going to stop sharing. David, are you online? I'm not seeing everybody here, but I will stop this.
I am here. I will, give me a moment. I will start toggling some screens and get it up. You know, John, I'm having trouble getting it up on the screen here.
Okay. We can go to 33.10 and come back if that'll help you.
1 second here.
Okay. Okay, keep going, David.
Yeah, I got it now.
Right.
Sorry for the hold up here in getting this processed. Okay, so before while I'm getting this up, I'll just share that, you know, for the outage reporting, you know, the general idea here was to pretty much have it similar to the EIM today, where planned outages are within the other balancing authority areas purview, and it's just the idea that the ISO needs to have notice of what planned outages have been approved by the respective balancing authority areas, and then that gets passed to the ISO for awareness and operating the market, and now it'd be the day-ahead market as well as the real-time market. And then for forced outages similar to EIM, we would then have those forced outages reported directly to the ISO. Okay, so hopefully screen is up and sharing here. So I will scroll down to the outage section, and I don't believe there was even a significant number of comments on that material, but we'll get there. Just a brief moment here. Okay, great. We're in 33.9. Okay, so first question, and just to confirm, my screen share is working?
Yes.
Great, okay. So in 33.9.1, PG&E has requested more detail about what is being included in the outage report. So I think this is similar to the approach we take in existing tariff. The request was, could we have more detail in the tariff about this outage report that an EDM entity scheduling coordinator must submit? And you know, we think that is more along the lines of a BPM detail in terms of the specific sort of format and details of the outage report. The high-level principle would be here. We need a report, we need necessary information, but the specific details would be defined in the BPM, because that does get into also more of a, you know, the reporting interface, and, you know, our existing outage management system is set up one way. Conceivably, there could be, you know, changes to that interface that's made as part of the EDM implementation or whatnot. It would be more amenable to having it as a BPM level detail. We added that phrase "and in the manner" just to sort of more directly tie the concept together, that is a level of detail that will be forthcoming in business practice manuals. And then there's a similar question, I think, again, same concept with EDM entity scheduling coordinator notifying the ISO of the transmission limits and any issues there. Similarly, we would just have that as a BPM detail in terms of the details of how the EDM entity scheduling coordinator would report those transmission limits to the ISO. And I believe those were the only two, I think, comments we got on the outage section. So I'll stop there. If there's any questions or clarifications or questions on what I just offered. And I believe I might have said PG&E. If I did say that, I misspoke. I believe it was Portland General, not PG&E, but PGE. But anyway, with that, I will turn it over to any questions we might have.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay. Well, with that,
No questions in queue.
okay, great. So with that, we're on to the metering and telemetry section. I believe, John, is it my time to pass the baton back to Bill, perhaps?
I think, except we have, Bill has crashed, not literally, but his machine has crashed. So we are probably within a few minutes of the lunch hour. And so given that, I don't want to try to wing his section on metering and telemetry. I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll break for the lunch hour. We'll come back. It won't take us but a few minutes to get through the meeting or telemetries, and then that'll bring us straight into the discussion on transmission availability in section 3316 to 33.18. So Isabella, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, John. So let's go ahead and break for an hour for lunch, and we'll meet back here at 1 p.m. Pacific time. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back from lunch. I'm going to hand it back over to Bill Weaver, and he will kick us off with section 33.10, where we left off before we broke for lunch, and then we'll hand it back to John after that to continue on. So, Bill, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, and Isabella, you can see my screen. This looks like a good size Zoom level.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm sure everyone is very sad that we couldn't do metering and telemetry before lunch, and we had to go to lunch slightly early, but we are doing it now. Before coming into this, I just want to quick overview in case it might not have been clear from the tariff revisions, and we didn't get, this wasn't one of the key issues in the policy development or whatnot, but the technical requirements for metering and telemetry really shouldn't be much different, at all different from the CAISO and EIM requirements. Really, when we're making specifications here about the EDAM, it's really just about the scope, about who's now under those requirements. So I encourage anyone who's worried on meeting or not meeting the technical requirements for metering and telemetry to look at our business practice manuals on both, because you'll see that, we do everything possible to stay really abreast of the technology and the advancements and try to be as accommodating as possible for the various technologies to meet these, pretty high level requirements. And failing that, please feel free to reach out to us and we can talk about, about any specific issue with our metering and telemetry teams. Okay, so we received some questions here in 3310, which we put in here deals with both metering and telemetry, which is a little different than the base CAISO tariff. But in any case, the first question was from PacifiCorp asking whether this provision on demand metering refers to, well, first they ask if the EDAM entity does not submit the load, then the customer must submit it. Yes, that's what this is saying. This is really referring to, load aggregation points, which is a, usually an LSC, a UDC function, a collection of P nodes, in contrast to like a participating load, which is, a single curtailable demand resource. So yes, not only can this be multiple meters aggregated into a single load resource, it generally or almost universally is multiple meters aggregated into a lap, as it were. Moving on down, questions on EDM resource metering. On interties, we made this clarification in response to a specific question. Generally, there are, specific meters on the interties themselves, especially between BAAs, and those are scheduling coordinator metered entities under the CAISO tariff. That's pretty much it on the metering. Now, telemetry, we received, quite a few comments from quite a few stakeholders, and I'll use, well, I didn't even like, the comment on it because I think everyone had the same requirement that we had used the CAISO telemetry language, which wouldn't impose anything from a technical standpoint different than what the EIM requires. But that language, I understand that stakeholders were confused thinking that we were requiring far more than what it looks like. So we've tried to make that language much more clear. It's not that the, ISO operations room needs a direct communications link with each resource. That can be through ICCP, just as it is today in the CAISO and EIM, nor is it that, the CAISO needs the ability to control. That is what the CAISO tariff says is the direct control requirements. But what we're really talking about there isn't like, coming in and controlling the generator. What we're really talking about is simply the ability to provide a telemetry signal to the scheduling coordinator to provide, the dispatch operating target. So hopefully that clears this up. We also, Bank had a comment on, I've also, I think there was a little too much CAISO language, and so we softened that up to make it more about reliability generally and the entire EDAM area rather than the CAISO control grid. Second, Bank had a comment saying that many EDAM entity OATs require telemetry for resources as small as 3 megawatts. The CAISO exempts resources that are under 10 megawatts unless they're providing ancillary services. And that's fine. Like if an EDAM entity tariff had more stringent telemetry requirements, well, the resource would still have to meet those as well. So I've clarified that. I also included a provision saying that, clarifying that these EDAM resource facilities also need to comply with their EDAM entity and local regulatory authority requirements in addition to these CAISO requirements. So hopefully that clears that up, but I'll pause here to see if anyone has questions on metering and telemetry. And then I think we're going to skip settlements today.
Currently no questions in queue.
As a reminder to raise your hand, you can press the raise hand icon located at the bottom of your screen or press #2.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, thanks, Bill.
Hey, John, while you get that ready, I see that PacifiCorp had a question in the comments saying that PacifiCorp West partitions into 3 custom laps for each state. Will an interstate line need to be registered as an EDAM intertie? Interstates need to have their own SQMD plan. I would say we can get into this offline, but the answer is likely no, they don't need to be. Again, what we really want are the tie point meters between BAAs. However, every load serving entity has the ability to add kind of custom UDC-based tie points where they want to, for example, usually it's the case where they want to have a separate unaccounted for energy calculation for a smaller entity within the larger LSC area, and there they can have these extra tie points as they are. So it's an option, but not required.
Thanks, Bill.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Bill. And like we said earlier, we're going to skip over the settlements for today, and that's here. And if we were to get there in section 11, but we'll combine the settlements together and do that after we get through the substantive sections. And some stakeholders said they might have additional comments. You know, you're welcome to submit things offline, but or to engage with us with a question. But it may be a little challenging, to get an incremental set of edits or something like that in the submittal form now, as we're working on updating the draft. But there will be a second round, and we'll obviously take additional feedback, and hopefully this session will provide answers to many of the questions you all may have had in settlement. So we'll go through this, and we're moving over 11, section 3311. So a couple of just sort of standard provisions for participation in the extended day market. These are the same as in the energy imbalance market. So you have the creditworthiness requirements, the dispute resolution requirements, and then the force majeure type legal requirements. And we didn't get any comments on any of those sections. And then we have a not used section, and then that brings us, let's see. Okay. All right. That brings us to the next sections, series of sections. We'll take them separately, but they work together to make the transmission available to the extended day ahead market. And so the first are what are called the legacy contracts. So these are the equivalent of an existing contract in the CAISO. So these are non-OAT transmission service arrangements, and they may or may not have existed prior to the OAT, but they're non-standard contracts. And in that context, the ISO has proposed to administer them in the extended day ahead market, as it does in its market for existing transmission contracts. And some stakeholders requested some further consideration of whether it's appropriate to include all of the provisions of section 16 and apply them. And here we do believe it works, and that we're going to administer them in accordance with section 16 as supplemented or modified by this section. So we think this construction will work. It's really just the administration of them, and it's not encumbering, transmission service on the ISO grid. It's just being facilitated in the market, consistent with section 16 and section 3316. So we're gonna continue with this structure. We didn't see any reason to reconsider it. But we're open to further discussion on that point if folks feel strongly about that. And then there was some comments and questions around, our administration of them and how they would be administered and whether or not they would be, treated differently or similarly. And again, we think that treating these legacy contracts as, in essence, as existing contracts in the ISO, at least in terms of their administration, the submittal processes for these TRTC instructions and the relative priorities of these rights in the market. That all comes through to us, and they'll be honored according to their terms as provided by the transmission service provider, or registered with the ISO in our system. So they may have, sort of priority rights all the way through to real time as they can in the ISO's balancing area. So all of that would be applicable here. In addition to that, these are just some clarifying notes we've made. This was part of the insure language that we've adjusted with the new transmission service provider requirements. And so it's more or less the same structure as before, with just these notes to answer any questions. And then once they're qualified, we have the registration process. And so there was some concern in this area that this information requirement was just sort of overreaching, that it had been entered into prior to the effective date. So here, the defined term is legacy contract, that it's a non-tariff-based transmission service, and it's up to the transmission service provider to define what those are. This is, it's their transmission service. It's not the same as an ISO RTO kind of context or consideration here. So we're fine just allowing the transmission service provider to determine what to be registered and not requiring these informational showings. And then the next, we had some comments about scheduling. And first of all, I think it was PacifiCorp asked for the settlement to be broken out separately from the scheduling provisions. So this is really just a little extra detail on the settlement provisions below. But in terms of scheduling, we've only made this one change, and some have been requested that are these rights, in other words, managed at both internal interties, so between BAAs, or are they also addressed for external interties? And I think the answer is that these legacy contracts really are only dealing with transfers, EDM transfers in context of the ISO markets. And if there need to be managed at external interties with other BAAs, that those that get managed by the TSP, so they do not get accounted for in the market in terms of their scheduling and use at external interties with non-EDAM BAAs. So I'm going to keep moving down to settlements, and in the settlements, we've added some additional provisions just to make it more clear how the settlements of these would occur for both the transfer revenue and the reference to section 3311, and then the congestion revenue, again, in reference to section 3311, just to make that a little bit more clear. So that's legacy rights. And I think what I'll do is I'll keep going through ownership rights, because these sections are parallel, and the comments we received were very much in parallel. In other words, there's not a lot of distinction between the treatment of the ownership rights to the extent they're made available for transfers, and the existing contracts to the extent, or legacy contracts to the extent they're made available for transfers. So again, like I said, parallel responses to comments, parallel changes to these provisions here, terms, say, of scheduling, and then the settlements, same parallel changes there. And this was the one comment that's a little bit different, and I'll explain this, is when you have a legacy contract, the transmission service provider is the same, or not same, it's an encumbrance or whatever, a contractual entitlement or encumbrance on the transmission service provider's facilities. Whereas an ownership right, it's really, you know, it's a separate facility, or in some cases shared ownership of a line, that kind of a thing. And in this context, the transmission rights holder, you know, if they wanted to be a transmission service provider and be part of the extended day ahead market, they could do so and sign an EDM transmission service provider agreement and all of that. They don't have to because they own the transmission. And if they don't participate entirely as a transmission service provider, they of course can make their capability or capacity available for transfers and receive the revenue accordingly. But that's the difference between those two, and that's the reason for this distinction here, and why we've said that if they're also a transmission service provider, will afford its customers similar treatment. So, all right, I'm going to open it up for questions on legacy contracts and ownership rights as far as transmission availability in the EDAM, and then we'll move into the tariff-based or OAT transmission service availability for EDAM, and that's where there's quite a bit more changes, and I'd say considerable commentary on those provisions from stakeholders. So let's see if there's any questions.
So while we're waiting for people to join the queue, we did have a question in the chat. So in bullet 33.16.1C, did you mean to say EDAM entity as opposed to EIM entity?
So let me read this. So this is the question. Any applicable. Okay, so this may have been a glitch. I thought at some point we corrected this, but yes, we meant to say EDAM entity.
Thanks for that clarification.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
There are no additional questions on the phone or WebEx audio.
Okay, all right, now, so we're moving on then to, and like I said, there were a lot of comments, and we'll do our best and kind of summarize and open things up for discussion. I think this is an area where people will want to see the revisions and read through them on their own. There's, you know, of course, availability of transmission is essential to the operation of the market. It's also an area where transmission customers have interest and views that may or may not align with their transmission service provider interest and all of that. And this will all be subject to amendment of the transmission service provider's open access tariffs to facilitate the implementation of these provisions. I'd also note, I don't know who may have been following along, but there was a recent presentation from the CAISO, Mark Rothleader, at a Western Resource Adequacy Program meeting that he described the priorities in the treatment of transmission service made available in the EDAM. And it was sort of like there was one slide with the bubbles, and we can work to make that available through future materials. But what we're doing here is consistent with what was explained there. Some people like to see the diagrams, but in the tariff world, we have to get the words right. So that's what we've tried to do here. And I guess the first comment I'll start out with was, you know, what this is not the universe of transmission availability, because we just had the legacy rights and ownership rights. So this is really just tariff transmission services, and that also includes the ISO, because we're making available transmission services under the CAISO tariff down below. And the first set of sections, 18.1, 2, and 3, talks more about the EDAM transmission service providers. So again, throughout we've made these ensure, we've flipped up the obligations, so it's rests with the transmission service provider and not the entity, and included some different cross references and clarifications to help navigate that. I'd say the most, I mean, it's just additional contextual language, but we did, at the request of the stakeholders, clarify that we're honoring physical transmission rights, these transmission services under a tariff, if they include physical rights and financial rights, but I'll get to that down below, at the EM enterprise as provided under the transmission service provider tariffs. So that, in our view, is just clarifying language, but if it's important for stakeholders, we're happy to say that we're honoring those physical transmission rights. And I'd make it point here. We're honoring the physical transmission service rights as they will exist under the EDAM transmission service provider tariff as amended to implement the extended day-ahead market, which would be consistent with these provisions. So whatever those physical rights are in the future, that is what we would be honoring under these provisions. Okay, so now it's a bit interesting of evolution, but and still relevant. But when we first started to develop the tariff language, there was some greater distinction between the treatment of transmission at EDAM external enterprise, so those are enterprise with non-EDAM BAAs, and at EDAM internal enterprise, which we'll get to in a minute, which are all the buckets and pathways down below, and where EDAM transfers occur. Over time, as far as the treatment, so in terms of the market, in terms of the scheduling timelines and the relative priorities and treatment in the day-ahead market, coming out of the day-ahead market, and then going into the real-time market. Now that's pretty much all been aligned, so it's really not treated any differently, and we'll get down below into the priorities and the contract reference numbers, the assignment of the contract reference numbers, and the mechanics of some of that. But I just wanted to let people know that for those purposes, there's no real distinction. The main distinction is now that transfers, as always, occur at internal interties and not these external interties. And that's why things like mirror system resources are required at the external interties and things of that nature that are not required at the internal interties. So there was one stakeholder requested additional information about whether or not, I think it might have been patterned, whether or not additional provisions were required for the export of pseudoties from EDAM BAAs to non-EDAM BAAs. And again, we don't think that there's additional need for clarity here in the CAISO tariff. Pseudoties are generally managed under the transmission service providers tariff, including the CAISO tariff. So we have our rules about pseudoties and pseudotie exports from our BAA, and others would have similar rules, and the EDAM would account for all of that accordingly in terms of, you know, if it's a pseudotie and it's qualified and registered as such, that resource would be treated accordingly. All right, there's that everyone's favorite word again, so we don't need to talk about that further. And then just some simplification of the language here as far as coordination, communication, and then adding other EDAM entities, because it can be more than just the CAISO. Okay, then those rights are, there's qualification, and there's different rights that qualify for as external intertie transmission service arrangements. And here we have a stakeholder comment requesting additional specificity to standardize the administration of internal transmission rights. And we're focusing, at least in the EDAM, on the interties, external and internal, and true internal firm conditional point-to-point network integration services not associated with an intertie are going to continue to be subject to the EDAM transmission service provider's tariff and are not really managed or anything or scheduled in the CAISO, or excuse me, in the EDAM or the market. They are internal to a BAA, and they can continue to serve the needs of the resources and loads that rely on those services. And of course, the resource and the load are bid into the market, but the transmission itself is not part of the market optimization in terms of the CAISO market. But all of the transmission service provisions for those internal rights continue under the transmission service provider's tariff. All right, then the rights, there's a registration process. We've talked about this before, but the registration process, it may vary slightly, but it'll account for these firm rights and other rights, you know, that are of varying durations, and all of that. And basically, I think that the ISO is going to collaborate with the prospective EDAM entities to try to develop some sort of a registration process that minimizes the burdens on transmission service providers and customers. That has not happened yet, but once the registration process and systems and everything are further along, more well known and understood, then we'll be documenting those kinds of things in the timelines and procedures under our business practice manual. So as far as scheduling of those, there was a comment whether there was accounting for a secondary network transmission service, and I think we're understand that comment and have added a reference there to make sure that was clear. And then we begin into the intraday schedule changes. So what happens if there's intraday schedule changes? And we got a comment that, you know, they're not late, they're permissible under the OAT, and they should continue to be permissible, and they will be under the EDAM. And so that was a clarification of that reference. And then there was some question about what is the different priorities, and what we've done, rather than try to deal with these kinds of you know, what is going to happen to these rights, we've got a whole new section down below that covers the issuance of the CRN and the treatment of the CRN based on the different timelines and submissions. So it's a new section, and we think it'll clarify things for everyone as far as the expectations on both the front end and the back end as far as treatment of those transmission rights in the EDAM. So again, we had a comment from stakeholders about how they might be more proactive in managing these schedule changes to mitigate adverse outcomes. I'd have to say that the market, the solution, at least from the market, will be account for all of these priorities, and it'll produce, you know, the feasible schedules from the day-ahead market. And then there are those other provisions in both the energy imbalance market and then that provision earlier today in the operations section of 33.7.5, where we talked about what the EDAM entity and the CAISO may do in terms of adjusting EDAM transfers. And this is just simply saying that if that occurs in the real time or whatever, the CAISO will adjust the day-ahead availability of associated transmission service rights. And all this is necessary and consistent with the transmission service provider tariff. Then you have the settlements of these rights, and essentially that will occur with the scheduling coordinator that submits the self-schedule. So if it's before the day-ahead market, that would be the scheduling coordinator for the resource, or sorry, the CRN, congestion revenue rights number, or if it's after and it's part of these permissible intraday schedule changes, then that would be submitted by the EDAM entity scheduling coordinator on behalf of the transmission service provider. Okay, so then the last is the registration and tagging. So it describes how they're registered, and we have, and I think this came up below, and I didn't make a note of it here, but I think it was Idaho Power had a question about pre-market and after the market tags, and whether that's the appropriate vehicle. But I think that's more in the context of transmission supporting EDAM transfer. So we'll get to that down below in just a minute. And then we did have a comment about whether or not it was clear, sufficiently clear that it also could be these external resources might be utilizing some of this transmission to support the resource efficiency evaluation. And so we've added a cross-reference to the bidding and scheduling rules for that, so that this is the procedure whereby you can count unknown sources of supply in terms of the resource efficiency, and then you can submit a tag after, I think it's 3 hours after the close of the market, you have to submit the tag. So this is accounting for that, to make sure that was clear. All right, now, so that's external interties, and then we're going to get to internal interties here, which are the buckets and pathways and the clarification around that. And then after that, we'll get to the provisions around scheduling priorities and the assignment of CRNs to the different transmission rights. But I think what I'll do is see if there's any questions on, and now I'm going on a subsection basis, but I'll just see if there's any questions around external intertie transmission availability before we go to internal transmission and what supports transfers and all of that. Any questions?
There are currently no questions in queue.
All right. Must be the after lunch effect. Yeah, I had to have a salad myself just to make sure I didn't nod off here. No, I'm just kidding, but I did have a salad. All right. Internal interties. All right. So again, this was our breakdown or representation of what we all used to refer to in the stakeholder initiative as buckets and pathways, the pathways being under bucket 2 and bucket 1 and then bucket 3. And we've not utilized that terminology, but follows the same basic framework here. So there was the first question that we really had was around whether or not, which firm or conditional firm rights would qualify under the OAT. And the CAISO, at least for purposes of framing the tariff requirements and in reliance on what's really going to be a subject of qualification for the transmission service provider's tariff, we think that this is sufficiently clear, and these terms are relatively well understood, and that we don't need anything more specific. But we did add two things to distinguish. One, that these are hourly increments of transmission, and then that if it's network integration transmission service, that's separate and distinct from available transmission capability across the intertie. So there's a separate section below on ATC. That's of course bucket 3. So we have bucket 1, 2, and 3 sort of ideas below. All right. So then there's some clarity around the how legacy contracts may support our ownership rights, and also EDAM transmission service provider rights that are eligible, because we're in an introductory sort of contextual discussion before we get into the specific buckets down below. Now, we did have a comment here where there were some stakeholders who expressed an interest in how they might, we commented on this above, proactively manage. And again, these market priorities, I think, are accounted for through the market, and operations staffs are going to have to utilize their best goal. And what's going to happen is that each EDAM entity associated with the service provider may adjust day-ahead market availability of transmission service rights in accordance with their tariffs, so they can be more proactive before the market and adjust the transfer limits according to expected conditions, so that the actual outcomes in the market are not unnecessarily or excessively adverse on either conditional basis or a persistent basis. All right. So now we're getting into transmission to support resource efficiency. And so I think we've provided some clarifying edits here, just to simplify things. Some of this was already stated above, so there's no need to repeat it here. And basically saying that entity, this is all about the resource efficiency and what transmission can support that. And there was several comments, and I think we've accounted for them below in the new section we're going to get to in a minute that talks about it. But the bottom line is that the transfers, even if not identified by the EDAM entity, so this is transmission provided by the entity for purposes of supporting transfers, that the other EDAM transfers are also eligible to support resource sufficiency qualifications. So it's not exclusive to this form of bucket one transmission. Other EDAM transmission that's available may also support the resource sufficiency. All right, we got a question with some concern about what does this mean about why are you saying that transmission is not known before the day-ahead market? So what we're saying here is that because of the mechanics of the way the resource sufficiency works, and that you can show availability of supply, and you don't have to tag it until after the day-ahead market, that if it's external to your BAA, that this transmission that may ultimately support the delivery, it's not known, and so therefore it's not available to support transfers. Okay. Looks like got a question from VJ. And raised hand. Go ahead, VJ.
That actually, this is a very big, right where you have highlighted, John, and I don't know who else raised a concern. I ran out to let the mailman into the office. This is actually a very semantically big deal for WRA, because I think you need to clarify, please, is operationally you're not able to know when the delivery is not feasibly able to be tractable, tractable, versus maybe the rules are designed to not know what transmission will be able to commit to ensure that delivery will happen. So if you truly want the EDAM to grow in the West, I think this is a very important area. I appreciate the language being clarified because it's not clear. It's
okay. How do you see it working, Vijay? I'm just curious as to.
I think I'm more concerned with and I missed the comment of the other earlier commenter they spoke, but from what I read is I think we need to be more clear about what do you mean if it is not known. And if it is not known because the rules are designed that way, you don't know how the commitment on the RSC will be, then that's another issue. But the way it is written here, the way I read it, presents ambiguity and lack of consistency of decision making.
Okay, well, I'll make a note and we can take that back. EJ, I hear what you're saying. I think we're making a fairly simple point here, but it was an important point that it's just because that external supply is not known and the timing is off, that whatever that transmission that's available for that delivery of that resource for the RSC, it's not known, so we can't make it available. The EDAM transfers are only determined in the market,
Perfect. I think the key word you said is because the timing is off. I think that needs to be clear in how you clarify this, because it otherwise looks like, well, you don't know whether we'll have a defined and reliable and committed transmission to back this up. So we don't know if we'll be able to support EDAM transfers. That's how I'm reading this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I think your question's been answered, so I'll ignore that, BJ. All right, moving on. All right, so now that was the entity. So the entity was providing transmission for the resource efficiency for its BAA. And now we are moving on to transmission that's provided by transmission customers. And we got comments seeking clarity around some of these headings. So we're trying to improve things, and we appreciate that kind of feedback. So the first one is, I think we're going to get to this in a minute, and this was really the subject of the presentation the ISO made at the RAP meeting, but it was really, they wanted to set aside time at the workshop to discuss interoperability. And if any folks have comments about that, let's have that discussion when we get to section 33.18. I'm not sure we can answer them all here today, but I didn't want folks to think we didn't see those comments and have an opportunity to talk about them. So we'll get there in a minute. And then somebody asked the question, what does it mean, the start of the day-ahead market? And we do have a defined term, the market close of the day-ahead market. So that's 10 a.m. at the moment, but yeah, theoretically that could change. So we'll make that change, clarifying change throughout. So here, this is the introductory language on the 3 pathways. And then we have the 3 options to submit we have the 3 options to submit schedule, self-schedule for energy before the start of the day-ahead market or the market close of the day-ahead market. And then the second option, which is to release the transmission, which is the pathway 2, so they can release it to the market and then get the revenue, transfer revenue for that. We had a comment, and it said, the comment, I think, was limit the scheduling coordinator requirement to release of transmission under pathway 2. So this may have been, I don't know if this was NV Energy or others, but the basic comment is that the transmission customer should only be responsible as a scheduling coordinator with the ISO for the release, this pathway 2 release of transmission. They shouldn't be responsible, say, above under pathway 1 for the submission of the schedule and all of that. So here, we think there's likely to be differing views, but we're taking the tack that the transmission customer is responsible for the 3 pathways for which it has an option. So A, it can schedule, B, it can release, or C, it can not schedule, make an intraday schedule change. And the only difference is in that case, that third case, that the scheduling coordinator is the EDAM entity scheduling coordinator and not the customer, because that's occurring after the day-ahead market, sometime before real time, and only the EDAM entity is allowed to make those intraday schedule changes in the market that would then go into the real-time market, and permissible intraday schedule changes. All right, so release of the transmission prior to 9, then a few clarifying edits that the scheduling coordinator representing the rights gets to make the decision on whether or not to do that, and then the EDAM entity associated will ensure that the information on the release is communicated and associated with the transfer system resource. And here we have a reference to the timelines and procedures in the day-ahead market. And I'll take a moment here. There was several comments about whether or not the references the ISO has taken satisfy the rule of reason in terms of utilization and reliance upon the business practice manuals. And we're going to continue to evaluate that. I think we've done our best in this, working draft here that you're seeing to address those. But if there's particular points of concern that folks have, then we'll be happy to talk further about that. But that's an iterative process for us. So we'll continue to pay attention to that. Again, here we have a internal intertie, permissible intraday schedule changes. So those are all permitted if they don't use their rights as allowed above or released. And that capacity is then made available for transfers in the day-ahead market. Customer may nonetheless later exercise its rights. And again, we had some concerns about the mechanics of this and whether or not there was some oversubscription of the transmission system if a firm transmission rights holder can later schedule after the EDAM has firmed up the transmission as a transfer. And that gets into that whole discussion around what do we do if we identify particular paths or like flow gates and stuff that are persistently problematic. And we'll get into that a little bit more down below, and we can talk further about that as needed. All right, then we get to the final bucket, which is the unsold transfer capability or available transfer capability. So here we should know what's been released to the market by 9. We should know what's been scheduled by 10. And then the EDAM transmission service provider is going to have to calculate what is available, and the entity is going to have to communicate that to us as a single limit available for transfers at each internal intertie. And we did receive, this is where I alluded to earlier, a comment about the ETAG not being the best method to submit those requests or to make those transfer limits available. And I think particular request was to defer to the BPM. The ETAG may not be the best method to communicate. So we're happy to talk about that here today. And also this stakeholder wanted the ability to modify the capacity available on its system and communicate these transfer limits and make only the smallest value available for the transfers. And I think what the ISO has done is tried to clarify that its expectation is that a single ETAG would come in from the agreed upon scheduling coordinator to tag this value, and that we reflect additional details on that. And I saw Kathy raise her hand, and I'll queue up George. I may need George here in a minute, but Kathy, why don't you go ahead with the question? I think this is
Kathy Anderson, Idaho Power, and this was probably coming from our comments. So I'm just like thinking about the practicality of how this works. And I'm thinking about, like today in EIM, how we let you know of limits between us and another EIM entity. And you take the most limiting limit between the both of us. And ETAGs like require an actual registered source and sink. Everyone along there has to approve it. So I'm just thinking mechanically, this maybe isn't the right way if you're talking about limits. And that's kind of where I was getting to with this comment from Idaho Power was mechanically, ETAG's probably not where you want to do it. Ultimately, we're going to need an ETAG for the transfer. 100% agree with that, but not for the limits. And so I think, I'm happy to talk more offline about the mechanics of it, but just thinking about how do we let you know of what that limit is or what that availability is. And I'm just not thinking this is the easiest mechanism, because I would anticipate sweeping something from my system and sweeping it over to yours, and then you can determine from there. And it wouldn't be an e-tag because I'm not creating e-tags as a TSP. So we can talk more offline though. Feel free to reach out to me.
Okay. I think I understand what you're saying. It's this pre-market e-tag, like as the means to communicate the transfer limit available at that intertie. I hear your concern. I'll see if anyone on the line from the ISO wants to respond, or we'll just take it up after the fact.
Hi, John. This is George Angelidis. So we do not envision the submission of e-tags where we can get the information for the scheduling limit. There will be a declaration for the scheduling limit by the EDAM entity, that is the designated EDAM entity to submit the limit for a specific transfer. And that designation can happen in Cyber. That's our current design. If we need to change it, we can talk more about it. But in real time, we have this ability to receive dynamic limits because it's an operational environment, and we receive it from both sides, from either BAA on either side of the transfer, and we select the most limiting value. But for EDAM, for the next trading day, tomorrow, we don't believe we need that complexity. We assume that the EDAM entities on each side of the transfer, they can coordinate and submit. One of them submit the scheduling limit for the transfer before 10 a.m. in Cyber, and then we'll use that as a scheduling limit solution for the market.
Okay, so I see Kathy's back, but no e-tag, but one scheduling coordinator needs to submit. Okay, Kathy?
I think we need to talk a little bit about that more, George, because that's going to take a lot more coordination than occurs today. So for example, Idaho may have an ATC value of firm capacity on the import side of an intertie with PACE that may be different than their export limit. And that could be due to various different firms sold at different locations. And so, you know, what you're asking is that every intertie that we've got, that we now coordinate before 10 o'clock with each other, as opposed to each of us sending some kind of limits to you, and you guys, you know, programmatically finding the most limited. So I think we need to talk a little bit more. Again, it's based on the mechanics, and I'm not sure that the coordination that you think is going on is going to go on. So.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
George, anything?
Yeah, as I said earlier, we didn't think that it would be a problem to coordinate in the day-ahead market. You have a lot more time. It's not an operational environment. But if that's not the case, we are happy to take this back and rethink. And yes, we should have some more discussion on that, Kathy.
Okay. All right. Sounds like follow-up. I captured the comment. And then the last piece here is just the communication back from the CAISO as to what quantity of transmission was used in the ISO day-ahead market, and then that's left over and made available back to the transmission service provider for availability in accordance with its tariff and Section 29 in the real-time market. Same comment around e-tag being here and ISO communicating back with an after-the-fact tag. Maybe that's not, well, this needs to align with that, so I think enough said about that. Okay. I'm going to pause before we get into this new section, see if there's any questions about the buckets and pathways. There weren't a lot of changes really fundamentally to any of that, a lot of clarification, but I'd open it up to questions, and then we can spend some time here on this new section. I'll walk everybody through it and see if anyone has any comments about that new section. Anything about what we just discussed?
Yeah, so John, back on or up towards section 33.18.2.2.2, we have a question in the chat just asking, under those provisions, would the transmission customer have a direct transmission scheduling and reporting relationship with the ISO rather than reporting transmission through the BA EDAM entity for RSE?
Okay, so this section, if I'm understanding the reference correctly, is about making the transmission available. So that scheduling coordinator that made its tariff transmission available for EDAM transfers, because it's across an EDAM internal intertie, they would release that transmission and the utilization of that would occur, and that following that settlement of that transfer revenue would be with that scheduling coordinator. But that may not answer the question. Can you read it one more time? Make sure I got it.
Yeah, and Carly, please raise your hand if you have more context to add. But the question is, would the transmission customer have a direct transmission scheduling and reporting relationship with the ISO rather than the reporting transmission through the BA or EDAM entity for RSE? And looks like Carly raised her hand. So Carly,
I do not think so, but go ahead, Carly, thanks.
Michelle, can we unmute Carly, please?
Hi, I'm Carly Page. I work for the Nevada PUC. I think maybe I'm getting bogged down in the details here. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the EDAM entity's role in transmission under these provisions. And I understand that the scheduling coordinator is the actual entity that is making these decisions or scheduling transmission, but is the transmission customer rolling their transmission schedules into the larger EDAM entities scheduling, or is that totally separate with a totally separate scheduling coordinator?
It's a fair question. So there's sort of three layers going on. One is the entity and their scheduling coordinator, and they have overall BA responsibility, right? Because this is occurring at the interties. Then you have an EDAM transmission service provider, which may or may not be the entity. Like if it's NV Energy, for example, they would be the balancing authority and TOP and the transmission service provider at an intertie. And then you'd have this customer who's taking transmission service, hypothetical, from NV Energy, and they would be deciding, hey, I have all this unused rights. I can make them available to the EDAM and earn the transfer revenues. So that's their decision. The customer gets to decide that. If they decide that, then they need to let the ISO know before 9 a.m. And then that quantity, whatever's released, would be available to the market and unavailable for their later use. And we'll get to that in a little bit. And then they would have a direct relationship with the ISO for the settlement of that quantity of transmission that they released. So, and then the entity is an overall responsibility. So their scheduling coordinators involved to make sure that the information is communicated to the ISO and associated for association with the system resource and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's helpful. I know it's complicated, so I appreciate your patience. Okay, and I'd be happy to talk, to you or others if it was helpful. As a follow-up, we can get folks here engaged to double check. All right. All right. So anything else you're seeing?
I do not see any other hands.
Okay. We'll move on. So we're still in this section 3318, and we're still dealing with these EDAM transfers and the transmission available at internal interties. And here, so we're asking, how does this work, and what are the various priorities, and what are the various timelines associated with that, and all of that. So we created a new section here and took some of the very high level stuff that was up above out and broke it down in more detail in this section. So we'll just walk through this, probably worth the 10 minutes or so it'll take, and see if folks have questions. But you know, I'll try to walk through it. I'll try to relate it back to what our understanding is of the EDAM and these priorities. But essentially, again, we're saying that the customers, transmission customers, they're going to retain their physical rights under the tariff, subject to the provisions above, which are the external intertie scheduling requirements or the internal intertie scheduling requirements. So the EDAM transmission service provider tariff would be amended to account for all of this, and those would be the rights that the customers would retain going into the EDAM. So then we'll assign a CRN for those rights, and for rights that are of a month or longer duration. We also assign, I think we have a separate process below for shorter duration rights. So don't be alarmed that if you have shorter term weekly rights, that those wouldn't be registered. It's not just may not receive the same contract reference number, or perhaps it will. This may require further clarification. But so those CRNs will be associated with transfer system resources at the external interties, and those are then associated with system resources outside of the BAA to account for the source of supply in relation to the external intertie. And then if the customer is entitled to a financial right, so this would be a marginal cost of congestion or marginal cost of losses hedge in some fashion under the transmission service provider tariff, then we would reflect those rights and refund them to the scheduling coordinator eligible for those, consistent with the section in settlement section. All right, so that's the basic process. So we issue the congestion revenue rights, and then our contract reference numbers, sorry. And then once those have been issued, each scheduling coordinator, they can submit their balance self-schedule less than or equal to the capacity associated with the ARN or the CRN, and that's basically this is pathway 1, and that will be assigned the scheduling priority in the day-ahead market above a self-schedule not associated with the CRN. So that's higher than an ordinary self-schedule in the day-ahead market. And also they would be treated in the day-ahead market in accordance with, and this is the reference to ETC treatment in the CAISO balancing area. So they get this higher scheduling priority in the day-ahead market. And then in the real-time market, they're afforded a scheduling priority equal to clear day-ahead self-schedules. So that's how we've described it. And then otherwise, so this is if it's not balanced, and perhaps, I could say if the schedule is unbalanced, but otherwise, the self-schedule be assigned the same priority as a self-schedule in the day-ahead market not associated with the CRN, and afforded a scheduling priority equal to clear day-ahead schedules in the real time. So assuming that self-schedule, when it clears the day-ahead market, then it'll be equal to clear day-ahead self-schedules. But in the day-ahead, it has a lesser priority. In other words, it loses a higher priority because it was not balanced. And then to help with that, the CAISO will notify scheduling coordinators if the CRN is not balanced prior to the market close of the day-ahead market, and the scheduling coordinator may update that to balance their schedule prior to the close of the market. And then a scheduling coordinator submits a balanced self-schedule less or equal to in accordance with, and here, this is the pathway 3, which is not pathway 3, sorry, yeah, pathway 3, the permissible intraday schedule changes. Then they're assigned a priority equal to the clear day-ahead schedules in the real-time market. Otherwise, they're assigned the same priority as a self-schedule in the real-time market. So it's a little bit, different expression, but we're having to work within the framework of the tariff and the relative priorities. But it's our goal and intent, and we appreciate your perspective, make sure that we are presenting what we've committed to present in terms of these relative priorities in the day ahead and real-time markets as those are submitted to the ISO, consistent with the pathways that are available. All right, and then what we've added is some important points so that it's clear that we're assigning transfer system resources to account for capacity transfers, and those are not assigned to CRN, but they may support these capacity releases as part of the RSE. So that is basically the bucket 1. It's not a CRN, but there's the capacity transfer and the resource efficiency optimization available. Then we say that we also assign a separate system resource or transfer system resource for customers, self-schedules, capacity releases, and then any portions of the CRN that self-scheduled will be available in the resource efficiency evaluation, so that any of the CRNs that were used for purposes of scheduling in advance of the market close would be eligible for resource efficiency, supporting resource, and then any portions that's released may not be later self-scheduled. This is to prevent sort of double counting, if you will, if it's been released to the market. And then if it's neither released nor self-scheduled, then of course, after the close of the market, they have their rights and they can submit these permissible intraday schedule changes. All right. Then I said that we would also account for shorter term rights. That's what this section does. It's basically saying that they're treated the same, but the process might be slightly different in terms of how they're registered. And we've referenced the business practice manual for that purpose. And then finally, if their schedules not associated with the CRN, they'll be afforded the same priority as other self-schedules. And what we're saying here is that we will not adjust self-schedules in the day-ahead market associated with the CRN to accommodate a self-schedule not associated with the CRN. And that's just to make it abundantly clear that the self-schedules associated with the CRN will have a priority over those that don't. Okay, that's a lot of new material. I sympathize, you haven't seen this before, and it may be difficult to follow along. If, you know, if there's anything we can do to help you, I'd be happy to answer any questions. At this time, of course, it'll be included in the subsequent publication of the second draft tariff, but I'll open it up here, see if we have anything more on this.
I think we have a hand from Kevin Smith.
Hey, John. Thank you. This is, yeah, it's a little overwhelming, to be honest with you. So I guess you had said at the beginning you were going to be releasing or publishing, is it June 5th, or is there going to be a preliminary red line?
So
when can we look at this draft, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, so we'll be publishing a complete second draft. But I can take back and think about if we could, like, maybe publish an addendum that was just this section or something, or these 3 sections or something, because I know half the comments that we got were about transmission. So we can take that back, because I do appreciate the challenge, you know, a bunch of new tariff language on a call. It's not easy, but we could maybe have a limited release of something. Would that be helpful? Kevin, are you back on mute?
Michelle, can you unmute Kevin again?
Yeah, sorry about that. It's like I can't unmute myself, so it's probably a good thing. Yeah, that helps a lot, John. It's just, you know, that we had raised this in a much more, let's just say, simplistic way. I think we wanted to just capture the concept of ensuring that there's, you know, overall an interoperability with RA obligations and adjacent BAs and so forth. So you guys gave a lot of thought to this, I know, and it's a big issue. So no, that's fine. It's just on the fly. I mean, my mind can't lock down tight enough to follow the bouncing ball through these details. So I look forward to seeing something that we can, you know, talk about among our others that have looked at this issue and have similar concerns. So thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that you guys have addressed a lot of these issues, maybe a little differently, but nevertheless. So thank you. No, that's good.
Okay, and Kevin, maybe intermediate step, I can talk to folks here and we can see if we can publish this section or these 3 sections or something as an addendum and revisit this on the workshop Friday or maybe the Monday. You know, I appreciate how important this all is to everyone, feeling comfortable, how much time we spend it on it in the stakeholder meetings, and we don't want to give it short shrift here in the tariff process. So yeah, I'll talk to folks here and see if we can do that. If that would help. There's no reason we can't circle back to this. You know, there's a lot of material to cover. I don't want to but yeah, we'll make it work. Other questions? I saw some hands go up. I don't know who they were, but
Yeah, let's go to Stuart.
Go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Stuart, you may be muted on
Make
your
sure
device.
the device is unmuted, your line is unmuted. All right, I don't know if Stuart changed his mind, but Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, John, I may break up. I've got some packet loss on this machine right now, but I would go a step further. Is there any way CAISO can consider releasing a full draft and then watermark this in some way that this is not meant? Because there is a lot to digest, there's a lot of thought, and if folks are working with others, we really need to those comments and maybe bounce some ideas back and forward. So I understand the challenge that you want to take the time to mark it up correctly. I appreciate that, hence the June 5 deadline. I just wonder if you can just release this version and or do something that would prevent folks submitting comments on this particular draft. Anything you could do would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, Stuart, I appreciate that. I think everyone, needs to appreciate our challenge, trying to take into consideration all the comments. I mean, we've had 2 weeks here, and then publication of a complete draft. Then it iterates an interim set of comments. When do we take those comments? How do they come in? Who's submitting? Then we're about to publish an updated draft, and in come a bunch of comments or something. So we'll think about it. I hear what you're saying, and I think at a minimum, these few sections might be appropriate, given this is new language here. But yeah. Okay. Any other comments?
There are no additional questions in queue.
Okay. Let's move on then. We'll see where we can get to. Hopefully we'll move along to something a little bit less new and maybe more. Okay, so we're still in transmission availability. So of course the CAISO has to make transmission available on the CAISO BAA. Someone asked a question about what these sections are referring to. And in this section 23, in the CAISO tariff version, there's going to be the whole scheduling priorities initiative draft tariff language reflected in that section. So however the mechanics of all of that work, that's how transfer capability, the interties will be made available, not entirely, but we have to consider both the EDAM provisions and the scheduling priorities initiatives and how that works for wheel-throughs and stuff like that, and those reservation capabilities. A few other clarifications here and which sections we're talking about. Then wheeling through, again, we talked about the cross-reference to add a little more clarity and certainty. And then we had the comment earlier, we talked about it, that are not known before the day-ahead market. I won't go back there, but BJ's comment earlier about the overall clarity of this clause here and whether or not we can do something more about that. And again, then we have a reciprocal with exports, so it's the same provision as we have otherwise, and the same cross-references. And then last in this section, and this is really just a contextual, it actually doesn't need to be here because these are all covered in these other sections. We talked about 33.7.5 this morning. And then we also have a reference to the constraint that prevents the transfers from exceeding, or not satisfying the balancing authority requirements before supporting transfers. And that constraint is discussed in section 33.27 we'll get to later. So these are just two markers to point people in different directions for some of these other things that were very important to folks in terms of making a transfer capability available and sort of providing that confidence in transfers that was discussed at length Okay, I'm gonna I'll just double check, see, since we're moving away now, at least for today on transmission, any other comments that folks are seeing or wanting to hear from us? Okay. We can move on to some other simpler provisions, and then we'll get into probably transmission revenue. Maybe we'll touch on that before the end of the day. Just some relative boilerplate language, the same as in the energy imbalance market on confidentiality and the application of miscellaneous tariff provisions in the ISO that are necessary to support the EDAM. This next section is important to EDAM transmission service providers because this is the CAISO tariff requirement for EDAM resources to have transmission service from their transmission service provider. And in essence, there's just a few clarifying edits here. And I'd have to say that a lot of folks commented on whether the ISO could mandate, in effect, what would be done is it'd be mandating transmission service providers to offer an hourly firm transmission service product. I know some do and some don't, and I guess many probably suppliers would appreciate if we make that a requirement. And this is not an ISO or RTO, so they are the transmission service provider, and we're supporting it if they offer hourly, but we're not going to require that. So that's how we view this as being resolved, and that's consistent with, I think, the discussion that occurred during the policy development process. The next comment, we got a hand raised from Caitlin, Energy Strategies. Caitlin?
Yes, on behalf of,
Can
you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, hi. This is Caitlin Leoteris on behalf of American Clean Power California. Understand what you were saying about CAISO not being willing to kind of require an hourly rate. Still think that that would be a lot more efficient, but I noticed here in the language that you've added that the transmission provider would assess an unreserved use transmission charge. And I think that language is highly problematic. Unreserved use tends to refer to a specific transmission schedule in open access transmission tariffs that is highly punitive. And there's a lot of precedent in the EIM when PacifiCorp joined, where that was kind of thought maybe that would be utilized as a charge, and FERC rejected that pretty resoundingly. So I think that term is problematic.
Okay, we hear that comment. I appreciate you pointing that out now and not yet. We will double check that and make sure. I think we were being responsive to some comment, but we'll make sure.
Yeah.
It's just the regular rate and not unreserved rate.
Yeah. Thank you.
Additional questions?
Okay. All right, so we're almost to the next discussion, which is more about transmission service rates. But before we go there, we'll close this out. And again, here, the transmission service will assess the hourly transmission service charge as described above. So we'll clarify that above to be the correct transmission service. And same here and here. Okay, thanks, Caitlin. And then a couple of unused sections, and then we're gonna get to transmission revenue recovery. And I get to have a short break anyway, and my colleague Bill is going to kick us off here and probably close us out. Hopefully we can get through this today, but if not, we'll pick it up on Friday. Bill, I'll stop sharing. Oh, she's already taken it.
Thanks, John. I feel bad closing the game here. I think it's been perfect pitching so far, and I hope we all appreciate. I think few lawyers are working as hard as John to establish a market in the West for everyone. So, thanks for all your work. Now let's talk about money. Section 26, transmission revenue recovery and charges. The purpose here, obviously, all the utilities still have their own transmission rate cases that allow them to recover their transmission costs and return on equity pursuant to their FERC-approved rate case or formula rate. What we're doing here is ensuring that there isn't cost shifting among different customer classes with the implementation of the EDAM. Avoiding rate shock, as it were, creating a soft landing between the two types of participation. So we got a lot of comments here. This is an important issue. Cost allocation always is, and so let's just get into it. The first thing here on 3326.1, this was sort of an introductory paragraph, and a number of stakeholders had comments saying, well, you should include this here, you should include this here, and my overall takeaway was I should just really cut most of this section out, which is what I've done, to avoid any potential conflicts or ambiguity with the more on-point subsections below. So you're seeing a lot of red here at 3326.1. There's no real substantive changes here. I'm just getting rid of this for lawyerly reasons. Let's see, moving down, wasn't too much on revenue shortfall allocated to gross load. On true-up, added some references to the CAISO PTOs as well as it regards WAC, which we'll get into a little shortly. There's a question here on the true-up, because we included language in the original about if there was a positive delta, if you actually, covered more than had been forecasted. Everything in the policy I've been thinking, we're trying to think, avoid the rate shock, avoid cost shifts, whatnot, making sure everything is trued up and balanced. But what if, someone collects more? Well, it would work just like a formula rate works, in that any extra revenue collection would simply be a credit on the next year, the next rate case's projected shortfall. So a credit, as it were, on the shortfall. Still, obviously collecting, but collecting just that slight less. That's the intent there. And I would say the intent for all of this is to simply follow the most, basic fundamental rate-making principles to ensure that we have just and reasonable rates and no misallocation of costs or rate shock. So what have we done here? 3326.2, same thing as I said up at the top. This was also kind of a little introduction, and I don't think it's worth it, and so I've cut it to only now have the subcomponent descriptions where everything is detailed and we avoid any conflicts. I think now getting into more of the substance of the policy. 6 cities, San Diego, other stakeholders brought up a number of very reasonable questions on the collection of third-party wheeling and CAISO PTO WAC revenues. I don't have specific reforms here other than to say we completely agree. We need to clean this up And we think most of that is actually going to come as we develop the policies in the CAISO BAA rules initiative. I think that's really going to be what focuses on the WAC revenues. So I'm going to work more with our settlements team and check in on that policy there. We might take some of this out of this, pure EDAM work and defer it to the CAISO BAA issue. All of these are kind of going to FERC at or around the same time anyways. But we agree with the comments. We need to be more specific and provide more clarity here. However, we think, the policy needs to be developed a little further. Just some grammatical cleanup here. Okay. Here is a more substantive policy change. I think Bank and a number of other stakeholders raised this issue of saying, well, it's a 3-year average look back. In the policy, we developed this idea that between the second and the third years, there would be a kind of formal mechanism to relook at these. Now, looking at the mechanics of how this shortfall revenue recovery works, it seems that this kind of formal idea of a look back is redundant. And so we propose removing it simply because, the requirement to have this most recent 3-year average should obviate the need for a formal look back. In other words, the transmission service providers are going to be recalculating this constantly to ensure that they're getting the correct revenue recovery. And as such, there isn't quite the need to revisit. This will be, fairly similar to how CAISO transmission revenue requirement works today, and that there's always kind of holistic changes to the TAC when transmission owners update their revenue requirements, when there's a new transmission owner, et cetera. And it'll be the same thing here as EDAM transmission service providers come into the EDAM, update their eligible shortfall revenue recovery, et cetera. Moving on. I think BPA had a question here, which is quite reasonable, on this first provision about new network upgrade costs approved by the local regulatory authority, or FERC, as applicable. And the intent there is to say, you only come to the CAISO and update these revenue requirements when they would actually start to be recovered from ratepayers, which is, in the case of most utilities, when they are approved and effective by the regulator. BPA, quite unique in this aspect. I don't think necessarily we need a tariff clarification here. I think, like as many requirements where the requirement itself isn't applicable, and we have as applicable here, someone like BPA that doesn't necessarily require another regulatory authority approving specific new network upgrade costs going to ratepayers, it would automatically meet this required tariff provision. But maybe we can clarify that in the BPM as well. Moving on. Here, we're looking at the provision on the CAISO assessing the EDAM excess charges and then allocating the revenues back to the EDAM entities and transmission service providers, as it were. I've added more here to kind of clarify this and break it out with a little more specificity, making it kind of more obvious that it's very much a two-part process in terms of assessing the excess charges and then allocating the revenues received. And one thing we definitely wanted to clarify, which I think a number of stakeholders brought up, was that the EDAM access charges are only assessed to the rest of the EDAM, meaning that each and no EDAM balancing authority area should be assessed its own projected recoverable revenue shortfalls, because obviously that would defeat the purpose. So that was the intent. We've now added language to clarify that. So hopefully that addresses the stakeholder comments on that issue. Remove local here. That was probably just borrowed from the CAISO access charge language, which deals with a kind of a regional and a local, but I don't want to confuse that. Each EDAM access charge will be relevant to the BAAs, but local is a confusing word to use there. So that is it with transmission revenue recovery. I will pause here to see any questions and comments on this section.
There are currently no questions in the queue.
Okay, well, I certainly attribute that to simply EDAM tariff fatigue. We've tried to give you a lunch break and not go till 4 or 5, understanding that, but certainly reach out to John and me if you have more questions or thoughts on this, very important part of the EDAM tariff. We're happy to continue to iterate on this. With that, I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Bill. And John,
Oh,
did you?
thanks, Bill.
Yeah, John, did you want to go through any others before we wrap up?
Let me just scan. Yeah, I think we can do a couple more, and then there's some simple stuff, and then we'll wrap up. I don't think wrap up will take 15 minutes. So let's just at least get through this next section 27. So yeah. So if you want to, can I share, or when can I share?
Yeah, you have presenting
John,
rights.
we do have a question in the queue as well.
Okay.
Go ahead and take that question while we're getting the tariff pulled up. Sarah, go ahead.
CPUC again. I missed part of the discussion where you talked about the release of the redlined version that you're going through today. And I didn't get whether you're going to release this version that we've been going through today or tomorrow or this week, or whether you're going to wait till June 5th.
Okay, fair question, and I'll cover it now, but it's undecided whether we'll release more than just section 33.18.3, the new tariff section, to help people understand the transmission availability discussion. But we'll commit to releasing at a minimum that new section for folks to have that additional context, and we'll take under consideration the other requests we received from folks on the chat and otherwise. But I'd like to discuss that with my colleagues and others here. Thank you. Okay. All right. I forgot to click on my video before I went off, but I think everybody's seen enough of me for the day. So we'll go through this section 33.27, and then and we'll get up through 33.30. That's a good place to restart again because that covers the bidding rules and stuff like that, if we don't circle back to anything in the meantime. But for section 33.27, so these are the parallel provisions for the extended day-ahead market of what is the ISO markets and processes. Includes all of the, not all, but a lot of the provisions around the market products and pricing, price formation and all of that. So they will apply to market participants in the extended day ahead market. And in addition, there's a few special provisions. And one is this transitional process. And this is what we called in the energy imbalance market price discovery mechanism, or the last economic bid, or whatever it was. It's essentially training wheels for 6 months so that prices don't get set at the parameter prices, so that we can determine prices based on the last economic bid rather than parameters. And these are the provisions that would implement that. We had a question from 6 cities, and with the FRP in place, should this only apply for FRP if an entity is simultaneously initiating participation in EDM and EIM? And so it's a fair question. I think that this would be, if they were implementing simultaneously, this would, I guess it would apply to both. Anyways, I think I'm gonna have to take this one back. And so that's the only question, and we'll take that back further. And then we have the LMP formation, and of course there were the changes to Appendix C. We're not covering that today. We had the creation of what we're calling default generation aggregation points. This is also described in Appendix C. And so there's basically these two DGAPs, the acronym. Then there'll be one in the Northwest and one in the Southwest, and these are for external supply resources outside of the EDM. And then this is that constraint, this power balance constraint relaxation, to ensure that each EDM entity makes sure to meet the BA requirements before supporting transfers. And then finally in this section, we have an exception to BAA rules. So these are the rules that otherwise would apply to embedded balancing area, integrated balancing area within the CAISO balancing area. And if those balancing areas, so in this case, we're talking about the bank, BA, and some other Northern California balancing areas, join the extended day ahead market, these provisions of the tariff would not apply. The next section, well, let's pause there and see if there were any questions on section 33.27.
There are currently no questions in queue.
Okay. Well, the next one, we got only one question, but it was repeated several times, asking why inter-SC trades were not permitted in EDAM. And the answer is that they're currently not permitted in the EIM, and that CAISO is proposing to align the EDAM with WEIM. We would like to understand, and this can maybe be the subject of further comments on the revised draft tariff language, what the benefits of inter-SC trades in EDAM might be to stakeholders. It's also our view that this inter-SC trades would continue to be supported within the CAISO BAA, and I think we're interested in seeking feedback. I'm not the expert on inter-SC trades or how they were facilitated or what their benefits or uses are, but if anyone has any questions about that now, we'd be happy to try to answer them.
There are currently no questions in queue.
Okay, and then the last section before we do a wrap up is just this section, which in the CAISO tariff is the EIM provisions of the CAISO tariff. And so we have tried to relate the EDAM section of the tariff to the EIM provisions of the tariff. And that's what this section is trying to accomplish. And, you know, we don't think that, you know, anything here changes anything the way it is. The whole point is to, you know, facilitate the EDAM participants, also continuing to be EIM participants and allowing for EIM participants to continue to participate just in the energy imbalance market and not in the extended day ahead market. Okay, so I'm going to open it up for any last final sort of overall comments or questions or anything else on the draft tariff, and then we'll talk about Friday.
There are no questions in queue.
Okay. So I hope people can see my screen because I'm seeing a lunch break screen still. So. But
If you can't see your screen, you'll be sure.
But when I was sharing it, I hope people could see it. I stopped.
Yes, we did.
Okay. All right. So, well, thank you very much for bearing with us and 4 hours of tariff. It's a lot. We did try to shorten it and break it up. And so that's why we have multiple days. This also gives us time to take things back and think about them. And I think the big thing we heard today, along with a lot of good feedback, was, you know, can you make this version or some version of this draft tariff available? I think I gave an answer to that question a couple minutes ago in response to that question from the CPUC. And so we will take that, and like I said, we're committed to publishing at minimum that new section of the transmission availability provisions, and we'll do that as expeditiously as we can. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll turn it back over to Isabella.
Thanks, John. So as you see here, this slide just outlines our upcoming meetings and milestones. So again, we'll continue this discussion on Friday, May 19th, with another virtual stakeholder workshop, as well as next Monday. Again, that one will be virtual as well. And we did post an agenda for all of these workshops to the EDAM initiative webpage. So that is available to you to review as well. And then also, as John mentioned at the beginning of the call, we are targeting early June, so the week of June 5th, to post the revised draft tariff language. And then the end of June or Q2 2023 for the tariff filing. And again, all of these dates are tentative, but we will confirm them through a notice in the daily briefing. And then there is also a link on the slide here to the initiative page, so you can view it directly. So are there any last questions before we conclude for today?
There are currently no questions in queue.
Okay. Well, then that concludes today's workshop. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.